Okay, so this is hard to talk about still. It's been a while, but even thinking about it makes my stomach churn. We live in Oakhaven, pretty rural place. Nice, usually quiet. I'm on the mounted rescue team around here. Know the woods like the back of my hand, or I thought I did. It started subtly, little things. I remember this night training exercise, maybe a few months back. We were in Shadow Creek Forest. That's a big stretch of woods behind Oakhaven. Gets pretty dense back in there. I was riding Balthazar, my old gelding, reliable as they come. We were moving down into this ravine, dark as pitch even with headlamps. And suddenly the horse ahead of me, Jonesy's horse, just went ballistic. Rear up, screaming, the whole 9 yards. Jonesy, who's a solid rider, barely stayed on, and the damn horse bolted back up the hill like something had stung it. We all stopped, naturally, thinking maybe a snake or something. I edged Balthazar forward, slow and easy, wanting to see what spooked Jonesy's horse so bad. Balthazar was being a bit jittery himself, ears twitching, nostrils flaring, but he was listening to me. We got to the bottom of the slope, and then I heard it, this growl, but not like any animal I've ever heard before. Deep, guttural, like it was coming from the ground itself. It vibrated through you. You could feel it in your chest. Balthazar went absolutely nuts. He spun around so fast I nearly went over the side, and he was gone. Just took off up that hill, ignoring the reins, everything. I had to grip on for dear life. By the time I got him calmed down and back under control, the growling had stopped. We went back to the spot, flashlights sweeping everywhere. Nothing, no tracks, no sign of anything, just the woods. We wrote it off to maybe a mountain lion, something unseen in the dark making weird noises, but it felt different. Then, a few weeks later, we went hunting with my son Tim out at Whisper Point. That's a really secluded picnic area, way back off the main road. Beautiful spot during the day, creepy as hell at night. We were sitting around the fire just after dusk, waiting to see if any deer came out. Quiet night, no moon. Suddenly, this howl ripped through the air, high-pitched, eerie, unlike a coyote or dog, and then, from way, way off in the distance, came another howl, answering it, sent shivers down my spine. Balthazar, who was tethered nearby, started stomping and whinnying, spooked all over again. Tim, who's usually pretty fearless, was looking around wide-eyed, asking what that was. Honestly, I didn't know. I just said it was probably wolves, even though wolves hadn't been seen around here in ages. But again, it didn't sound like wolves. There was something else in that sound, something wrong. The horses were definitely spooked. We packed up and left not long after. Didn't feel right to stay. After that, at a game dinner thing, some guys were talking about Old Robin Haven, another wooded area. 2 hunters, seasoned guys, said they were driving out late one night and something in the dark attacked their truck. They heard this crashing in the woods next to the road, and then BAM! Something slammed into the side of their truck, denting the door in and scratching the paint to hell. They floored it, didn't stop until they were back in town. They couldn't describe what it was, just said it was big, powerful, and sounded heavy, like it had weight behind it. Everybody at the dinner kinda laughed it off. Too much whiskey, maybe, you know how it is. But they were dead serious, shaken up. And then the story that really got to me was from Mrs. Henderson over in town. Sweet old lady, not prone to making things up. She told me she was driving down Covered Bridge Road late one afternoon with her grandkids in the back. Sun was starting to go down, shadows getting long. And as they passed this stretch of fence, barbed wire, good 6 feet high, she saw something climb over it. Just scaled it like it was nothing. Said it was huge, dark, hairy. Too big to be a bear, she said. Moved too fast. And the way she described it, it just unnerved me. She was terrified, said her grandkids were screaming in the back seat. She sped off and didn't look back. She described it to me, and the way she said, hairy and huge. I don't know, something about the way she said it made the hair on my arms stand up. All these things, separate, right? Could be explained away. animals, imagination, whatever. But they started adding up, this feeling that something wasn't right in the woods. And then came that day, the day that changed everything for me. It was a Tuesday. Started out normal. Got a call early afternoon. Hiker lost out in Shadow Creek. Standard call. We get a few every month. Usually just someone wanders off trail, gets turned around. No big deal. But this one felt different from the start. The call came from the hiker's wife. Sounded frantic. Said he'd called her. Said he was disoriented. Couldn't find his way back. Said he heard noises. Didn't elaborate. Just said noises and sounded really scared. Then the phone cut out. We geared up, me and a couple of the guys, Dave and young Mark, and headed out to Shadow Creek. We took the trucks as far in as we could, then saddled up. Balthazar was restless from the get-go, pacing in the trailer, snorting. Usually he's calm as anything before a search. But he was on edge, jumpy. I tried to calm him, talking to him, stroking his neck, but he just wouldn't settle. We rode in, heading roughly towards where the guy was supposed to be, based on his wife's description of his call. It was daytime, but even in daylight, Shadow Creek can get dark, especially deep in the ravines. The trees are thick, blocks out a lot of sun. It was a still day, no wind, and quiet. Too quiet. Normally you'd hear birds, squirrels, something, but there was just silence, unnatural silence. We spread out a bit, calling out the hiker's name. "Mr. Henderson, can you hear us?" Just our voices echoing through the trees, and nothing. Creepy silence. Balthazar kept swiveling his ears, looking around, uneasy. I could feel him tense under me. We pushed deeper into the woods. We were in a section I knew pretty well, near that ravine where we had the night training. And that feeling of unease from that night came rushing back to me 10 times stronger. It felt heavy, like something was watching us. I kept looking around, scanning the trees, the shadows, but there was nothing. Just trees and bushes and shadows. Then Balthazar stopped dead, just planted his feet and wouldn't move. I could feel him trembling. "Easy, boy, easy," I murmured, patting his neck. He was staring into the woods, towards a thick patch of undergrowth, his nostrils flared, eyes wide. I followed his gaze, but I couldn't see anything. "What is it, boy?" And then I smelled it. This stench, foul, musky, like rotting meat mixed with something else, something acrid, chemical. It hit me hard, made my eyes water. It was overpowering, disgusting. Dave and Mark wrinkled their noses too. "What the hell is that smell?" Dave asked, voice low. I didn't know, didn't want to know, but it was coming from that thicket of bushes Balthazar was staring at, and the silence, that unnatural silence, was even thicker now, like the woods were holding their breath. That growling started again, faint at first, deep in the brush, then louder, closer, the same guttural, vibrating growl from the training exercise. But this time it was worse, menacing, hungry. Balthazar reared up then, just like Jonesy's horse did that night, but worse. He screamed, a high-pitched, terrified scream, and started bucking violently. I was thrown forward, lost my stirrups, clinging to the reins, trying to stay on. He was completely out of control, thrashing, fighting, trying to get away from whatever was in those bushes. Dave and Mark were shouting, trying to calm their horses, but their horses were spooked too, moving around, skittish. The growling was louder now, closer, right at the edge of the bushes. I finally managed to get Balthazar under some kind of control, but he was still shaking, eyes rolling, pulling hard on the reins. And then the bushes moved, violently, branches snapping, leaves rustling like crazy. Something big was in there, pushing through, coming out. The smell was overwhelming now, gaggingly bad. What I saw, I still can't fully process it. It came crashing out of the bushes. Tall, so tall, way taller than a man, maybe 7, 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur, dark, almost black. It was vaguely human-shaped, but not. Long arms that dragged on the ground, hunched shoulders, thick neck, and the face. It had a face, but it wasn't human. Snout-like, with these yellow eyes that glowed even in the daylight. And teeth. God, the teeth. Long, pointed, yellowed, like a predator's teeth. It stood there, in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, just staring at us, at me. That growl rumbled in its chest, low and menacing. And then it took a step forward. Balthazar lost it again. He spun, bolted. I went flying this time, hit the ground hard. Everything went black for a second. When I came to, I was lying on my back, wind knocked out of me, head spinning. Horses were gone, Dave and Mark were gone, yelling, fading away in the distance. And that thing was standing over me. It was closer now, towering over me. I could smell its breath, that putrid, disgusting smell. I could see the yellow in its eyes, burning into me. It was studying me. Curious almost, like it was trying to figure out what I was. I was frozen, couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just staring up at it, paralyzed by pure animal terror. It reached down then, slowly, deliberately. One of those long, fur-covered arms came down, and those claws, thick, black claws, like nothing I'd ever seen. They hovered over me, inches from my face. I closed my eyes, waiting for, I don't know what, to be ripped apart, eaten alive. I just waited, and then nothing. Silence again, except for my own ragged breathing. I opened my eyes, slowly, terrified. It was gone, just gone. The space where it had been standing was empty. Silence. Just the trees and the shadows again. I lay there for a long time, just trying to breathe, trying to get my legs to work. Eventually I managed to sit up, then stand. Everything ached, head was pounding, but I was alive. Unbelievably, I was alive. I started walking, stumbling, back the way we'd come, calling out for Dave and Mark, but no answer. Just the woods, silent and still, like nothing had ever happened, like I'd imagined the whole thing. I eventually found my way back to the trucks, hours later. Dave and Mark were there, shaken, horses spooked but okay. They said they'd been thrown too, ran like hell, regrouped, and come back to look for me, thought I was dead. They didn't see it. They only heard the growling, the crashing in the bushes. They think it was a bear. A really big, really aggressive bear. That's what they tell everyone. I haven't told anyone the truth. Can't. Who would believe me? Bigfoot attacked me in Shadow Creek. They'd locked me up. But I know what I saw. I know what I smelled, what I felt, the terror. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I've ever heard of. And the worst part, I still have to patrol those woods, still have to ride out there for searches. Every time I go back into Shadow Creek, I feel it. That presence, that heavy, watchful feeling, the silence that's too silent, the fear. It's always there, waiting. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it wanted. I just know it's out there, still out there, in the woods around Oakhaven, and I can't shake the feeling that one day it'll be back. And next time, maybe it won't just let me go. Story 2. It's still messed up even now, years later, and I know what I saw. My brother Marcus, he saw it too that first time, so I know I'm not crazy or imagining things. People tell you things are just your mind playing tricks, especially in the woods. But this, whatever this was, felt different, wrong. It started out like any other hunting trip. We'd been going to Cedar Ridge for years, me and Marcus. It was our spot, southeast Ohio, out in Willow County. You know, where it gets real hilly and backwoods. We loved it. Peaceful, quiet, and usually pretty good deer hunting. That year, though, things were off from the start, even before we saw it. We were driving out there early morning, still kind of dark, but that pre-dawn grey light starting to come up. Marcus was driving his truck, and I was shotgun, just watching the trees go by. Felt heavier than usual, the air, thick, and not just the humidity either, though it was late October, supposed to be crisp. This was something else, like pressure in my chest. Just a weird feeling, you know? like something was waiting. We were on some back county road, just past where the blacktop ends and it turns to gravel. That's when I saw it. We were rounding a bend, and my headlights swept across the side of the road. There was something there, hunched over. At first, I thought it was a bear. You hear about black bears making their way down to Ohio, though they're rare around Cedar Ridge. But bears aren't usually that tall or shaped like that. "Marcus, hold up, what the hell is that?" I said, pointing. He braked and we rolled back a little bit. Whatever it was right at the edge of the tree line, right by the ditch. It was big, really big, and it was covered in dark hair, black as night. But not all hair. It was like patches of hair, and then places where it was darker, like skin showing through, but not normal skin color, more dusky, gray-black skin. It was bent over something. We squinted, trying to get a better look. Then we realized what it was. A deer carcass. A buck. Looked like a decent-sized one. But it was just ripped apart. Guts hanging out, legs twisted at weird angles, like it had been torn open like a rag doll. And this thing was just on it, like it was eating or something else. Hard to describe. It wasn't feeding like any animal I've ever seen. It was rough, violent almost. My heart started hammering. I felt cold, instantly, not just chilly morning cold, but deep down, bone-chilling cold fear. This wasn't right. This was way wrong. I could see the shape of it better now. Tall, taller than a man, even hunched over like it was. Its back was broad, thick, the way it was positioned over that deer. It was just unsettling, primal. "Jesus," Marcus breathed out, his voice shaky. "What? What is that thing?" I didn't have an answer. I just stared, frozen. I felt this wave of pure, instinctive terror wash over me, like something deep inside my DNA was screaming, "Danger, get away." I wanted to yell at Marcus to floor it, just get us the hell out of there. Then it moved. Slowly, it lifted its head. And even though it was still kind of dark, and it was mostly in shadow, I saw something glint, like eyes, dark, but with a reflection, and it turned its head towards us. It wasn't like an animal turning to look. This was aware, deliberate. It felt like it knew exactly we were there, and it was looking right at us, even in the dim light, even with the distance. And it was heavy, the look, intense. I didn't see any features, really, not clearly. Just the dark hair, the darker patches of skin, the massive size, the hunched, powerful posture, and those eyes, or glints of eyes. That was enough, way too much. "Marcus, go, drive," I hissed, my voice cracking. He didn't need telling twice. He slammed the gas, and the truck lurched forward, gravel spitting from the tires. We didn't look back. Neither of us said anything for a good 5 minutes, just drove, both of us breathing hard, like we'd just run a marathon. Finally, Marcus pulled over on the side of the road, engine idling. He was pale as a ghost. Did you see that?" he asked, his voice still trembling. "Yeah," I said, my throat tight. "I saw it. Jesus, Marcus. What was that thing?" He shook his head. "I don't know. Bear, but bigger, way bigger. And that hair, and the way it looked at us." He trailed off, shivering even though it wasn't that cold in the cab. "Did you see its eyes?" "Yeah, I think so," I said. "Just glints. But it saw us. I know it saw us." We sat there in silence for a while, both of us just trying to process what we'd seen. It didn't make any sense. It was like something out of a horror movie, not real life. But we both saw it, clear as day, or as clear as the pre-dawn gloom allowed. We talked about turning around, going home, but we'd driven all this way, gotten everything ready. And the hunting season had just started. Marcus, he's always been the more pragmatic one. He said maybe it was just a weird-looking bear. Maybe we were just spooked. Maybe we should just try to forget about it and get on with our hunt. Deep down, I knew it wasn't a bear, and I knew I wasn't going to forget it anytime soon. But part of me, a stupid, stubborn part, still wanted to hunt. Wanted to prove to myself it was just my imagination or some explainable animal. So we kept going. We got to our usual spot, parked the truck and started hiking in. But the feeling, it didn't go away. The heavy air, the sense of being watched, it was still there, amplified even. The woods felt different that day, wrong, like they were holding their breath. Even the usual sounds, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, seemed muted, distant. As we walked, I started remembering something from years ago, when I was hunting alone out in Evergreen County, not far from Cedar Ridge. Different woods, but same area, same feeling. I was deep in, following a deer trail, when I heard it. A loud crack like a tree branch breaking, except it was too loud for a branch, more like a tree being hit, a hard, solid thwack. I froze, listening. Silence for a second, then another thwack. Closer this time. My heart started pounding then too back then. I couldn't figure out what it was. Wind was calm, no other hunters around I could hear. Just thwack, thwack, getting closer. And with each sound, I felt this creeping dread. Like whatever was making that sound wasn't natural, wasn't animal. I didn't see anything then, back in Evergreen. But the feeling of being watched, of something big moving in the woods around me, it got overwhelming. I felt like I was being hunted, not the hunter, and I panicked, just turned and ran. Didn't even care about the deer then, just wanted out of those woods. I ran until I was back at the truck, breathing in huge gasps, heart hammering like it wanted to jump out of my chest. I tried to forget about that, just chalked it up to nerves, maybe being a bit too jumpy alone in the woods. But now, this morning, seeing that thing on the road, it brought it all rushing back, the same fear, the same feeling of wrongness. And then, later that day, after we'd seen the creature while we were actually hunting, it happened again. The tree knock. We'd split up a bit, Marcus going to the South Ridge, me heading east towards the creek bottom. I was sitting on a stump, quiet, waiting, watching for movement. The woods were dead silent, unnervingly so. Then, wham, right behind me like a gunshot, a tree knock, so loud it vibrated through the ground, through my boots, right up into my bones. I jumped, spinning around, rifle up. Nothing, just trees. Silence again, except for the ringing in my ears from the sound. I stood there, frozen, scanning the woods, every muscle tense, thinking about Evergreen County, thinking about that thing we saw on the road, thinking maybe it was following us, maybe it was here, and then, wham, another one. Further off this time, but still loud, still sharp, like someone had hit a huge tree trunk with a sledgehammer. And this one, it didn't sound natural at all. Not like wood cracking or breaking, more like hollow and resonant, almost like hitting a drum, but a drum made of solid wood. Fear slammed into me again, so hard it was almost paralyzing. My breath hitched in my throat. My hands started shaking on the rifle. I could feel my heart pounding, echoing in my ears. It was back. Whatever it was out there, and it was doing this, making these sounds. I didn't wait around to see what happened next. I didn't try to rationalize it or explain it away. I just ran, just like I did years ago in Evergreen County. Ran blindly through the woods, crashing through brush, not caring about being quiet, just needing to get away. I ran back towards the direction of the truck, and as I ran, I heard them, more tree knocks. Wham, 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 wham. Not random anymore, deliberate, like they were tracking me, like they were coming closer. I burst out of the woods, into the small clearing where we'd parked the truck. Marcus was already there, leaning against the hood, looking white and shaken. He'd heard them too. He'd heard the tree knocks, and he'd seen something else. The deer, he gasped, pointing back into the woods. They all just ran, stampeded, like something spooked them bad. He was right. Even as we stood there, we could hear the sound of crashing undergrowth, the panicked bleating of deer fading into the distance. A deer stampede, in broad daylight, for no reason we could see, except maybe for those tree knocks, maybe for whatever was making them. We didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there, listening to the silence that followed the deer's flight. Then Marcus just shook his head. "That's it," he said, his voice flat. "I'm done. We're leaving." I didn't argue. I was done too. More than done. Terrified. We packed up fast, throwing our gear in the back of the truck, not even bothering to properly secure everything. We just wanted out of there. We drove back down that gravel road faster than we should have, tires spitting rocks, dust clouding behind us. We didn't see anything else on the road this time. No creature, no deer carcass. Just empty road and silent woods. But the feeling was still there. That heavy, watching presence, like it was still with us, even as we drove away. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Just sat in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd seen, what we'd heard, what we'd felt. It didn't make any sense, and it still doesn't, even now. We haven't been back to Cedar Ridge since. Not to hunt, not for anything. Marcus, he tries to joke about it sometimes, says we saw a really messed up bear, or maybe some weird deer disease. But I can see it in his eyes. He knows too. He knows we saw something else. Something unnatural. I still hunt sometimes, closer to home, in familiar woods I know well. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, in the woods, watching, waiting. And sometimes, especially when I'm deep in the trees, alone, I hear it. Just a faint sound, carried on the wind. A hollow, resonant thwack. And the hair on the back of my neck stands up, and that old cold fear washes over me again. And I know without a doubt that whatever we saw in Cedar Ridge, whatever is out there making those sounds, it's still out there. And I have no idea what it is, or what it wants. And that's the part that really messes with me to this day. It just is. And that's all there is. Story 3. It's still hard to talk about, even now, years later. People look at you funny, you know, like you're making it up, or you're crazy, or just something's not right in your head. But I swear to you, every word of this is true. And it happened in Byerley, a place that I used to think was as normal as anywhere else. Guess nowhere's really normal, is it? Not deep down. It started with my Jasper. He was just a kid then, maybe 8, something like that. We lived in the old Roberts place, out on the edge of Byerley, you know, where the woods start to get thick. One evening, just before dusk, Jasper came barreling into the kitchen, white as a sheet, eyes wide as saucers. "Mom, Mom, there's a monster in the garden." Now Jasper had a good imagination. Always had. I thought it was probably a fox, or maybe a deer come out of the woods, got into the flower beds. You know how kids are. They see something new, their imaginations run wild. I went outside with him, thinking I'd calm him down, show him it was just an animal, nothing to be scared of. But the second I stepped onto the grass, I felt it, a heaviness in the air. And the smell, it was musky, rank, like something wild and not clean. Jasper was pointing, shaking, towards the bottom of the garden near the old apple trees. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. But not like any footprints I'd ever seen before. They were huge, bigger than my 2 hands put together, and deep, like whatever made them was heavy. Really heavy. And they weren't paw prints, not exactly. More like human, but wrong. Toes, but too many and too thick. It just didn't make sense. We followed them to the back of the garden, right up against the tree line, and there, under the big oak tree, the one that always drops acorns all over the place, there was a patch of flattened grass, like something had been sleeping there or resting for a long time. The grass was all pressed down, and in the middle of it, there was this dark, greasy patch in the earth, like oil, but thicker, and the smell was stronger here, almost overpowering. It made my stomach churn. I tried to tell myself it was a big dog, a really big dog, but those footprints. Dogs don't make footprints like that, and dogs don't leave a smell like that. I got Jasper back inside as quick as I could, locked the doors, checked the windows. I felt uneasy, like we weren't alone, even inside our own house. The next morning, I went out in the daylight, hoping it would all look different, less scary, but the footprints were still there, clear as day. And I noticed something else. The fence between our garden and old Mrs. Henderson's place was broken. Big section of it just smashed flat, like it had been pushed over by something with no effort at all. And Mrs. Henderson, she was usually up early, tending her roses. But the house was dark, no sign of her. I walked over, knocked on her door. No answer. I peeked through the window, and that's when I saw it. Her rose bushes, her prize-winning roses, all trampled, ripped to shreds, like something had gone right through them, not even caring what was in its way. Later that day, the police came. Mrs. Henderson's nephew had called, worried because he couldn't get hold of her. They found her inside, shaken but okay. Said she'd been woken up by a noise in the night, a terrible crashing sound, and had been too scared to come out and see what it was. She hadn't seen anything herself, but she'd heard it. She mentioned a smell too, a bad smell, like mine. That's when people started talking, whispering mostly, about something in the woods. It happened again a few times over the next couple of years, always at night, always around the edge of the woods. Jasper saw it twice more, both times on his way to school. He had to walk down that lane, the one that runs along the edge of the woods, to catch the bus. First time, he said it was just a glimpse, a dark shape moving between the trees, just as the sun was coming up. Big and dark and fast. He was scared, ran all the way to the bus stop. The second time, it was worse. He said he saw it clearer, standing at the edge of the trees, watching him. He described it as tall, taller than a man, covered in dark fur, with eyes that glowed in the dim light. He said it didn't move, just watched him as he ran. He was terrified. He wouldn't go to school alone after that. I had to walk with him to the bus every morning, even when I had to get to work myself. And I felt it too when we walked that lane, a feeling of being watched, like there were eyes on us from the woods, even if I couldn't see anything. Then it all went quiet. For years. Life in Byerley went back to normal, or as normal as it ever is. People forgot about the footprints, about Jasper's monster. Or they pretended to anyway. I never forgot. Not really. There was always a little voice in the back of my mind, a prickle on my skin when I walked near the woods, especially at dusk. Then came 2008. That year, it was a bad winter, cold, lots of snow. Everything just felt bleak. It was a night just like any other, or so I thought. I was in bed reading, must have been about 10 o'clock. Jasper was at university by then, first year in Leeds. I was alone in the house. And then it happened. Bang! 3 loud knocks, right at the front door. So hard it rattled the whole frame. I jumped, my heart pounding. Who would be knocking at that hour? And that loud? I sat there for a moment, holding my breath, listening. Maybe it was just the wind, or a branch falling, but the wind was calm that night. Then it came again. Bang! 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 3 more knocks, just as loud, just as violent. This time, it was unmistakable. Someone was at the door, and they were not messing around. Fear gripped me, real, cold fear. It wasn't a normal knock. It felt aggressive, threatening. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I just stayed frozen in bed, listening, praying they would go away. But they didn't. They kept coming, those 3 knocks, over and over again, sometimes spaced out, sometimes in quick succession, always 3, always violent. It went on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, every time that same jolt of terror. Every time feeling more and more trapped, more and more vulnerable in my own home. Eventually, it stopped. Just as suddenly as it started. Silence. Thick, heavy silence. I stayed in bed, wide awake, listening until dawn. Peeking out the window every now and then, but seeing nothing. Just the empty garden, the woods looming dark and still in the distance. The next day, everything seemed normal again. Sun was shining, birds were singing. Foolishly, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream, until I went outside, and there, on the front door, right where the knocks had been, were marks. Not dents, not scratches, more like gouges. 3 deep gouges in the wood, like something heavy and sharp had been slammed against the door again and again. Not a fist, not a hammer. Something else. That was when the pecking started. Weeks later, maybe a month. I'd almost started to forget about the knocking, to tell myself it was kids playing a prank, though it hadn't felt like kids. It was late again. I was in bed, trying to sleep, and then I heard it. Tap, 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 right outside my bedroom window, like someone tapping their fingernails on the glass. I sat up, heart racing again, peeking through the curtains. Nothing, just darkness, branches swaying in the breeze, but nothing else. I told myself it was branches, just branches tapping against the window, but it was a clear night, no wind. Then it came again, tap, 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 closer this time, louder, and I realized it wasn't branches. It was too regular, too deliberate, like something was pecking. I got out of bed, slowly, quietly, crept to the window, pulled back the curtain just a crack, and there it was, right outside my window. A shadow, too big to be a bird, too dark to be anything normal, just a hulking shape pressed up against the glass. And then I saw it move, a long, dark shape moving towards the window, a beak or something like a beak, and it pecked again, harder this time. Crack, 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 and I heard a low growl from right outside the wall, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated right through me. I slammed the curtain shut, jumped back from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I remembered reading something, ages ago, in the local paper, about a woman in the next village had the same thing happen, pecking at her windows, growling outside her walls. They'd said it was foxes or badgers, but this didn't feel like foxes or badgers. This felt different, wrong. It went on like that for weeks, the pecking, the growling, sometimes every night, sometimes just a few nights a week, always at night, always when I was alone. It felt like it was testing me, seeing how scared I was, how much I could take. Then, just like before, it stopped, as suddenly as it started. Silence again. But the silence felt different this time. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful, like it was still out there, just waiting. Years passed, years of nothing, or nothing obvious anyway. I tried to forget it all, to tell myself it was my imagination, stress, anything but what it felt like. But deep down, I knew. Something had been happening. Something was still out there. Then it was 2015. Another cold winter, another blanket of snow over everything. I woke up one morning early, still dark, looked out the bedroom window, and the whole world was white. Fresh snow, crisp and clean. For a moment, it was beautiful, peaceful. Then I saw them, footprints, in the snow, in my garden, coming from the woods, right up to the house, circling the house, then going back into the woods. And they were huge, bigger even than the ones from all those years ago, clear as day in the fresh snow, monstrous. My blood ran cold. It was back. Whatever it was back. And it had been right outside the house, all night, watching me. That night I was terrified. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed with the light on, just waiting for something to happen. And then it did. It started as a low moan from somewhere out in the woods. Faint at first, barely audible. But it grew, louder and louder, turning into a howl, a long, drawn-out, unearthly howl that sent shivers down my spine. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not a dog, not a wolf, not any animal I knew. It was primal, ancient, terrifying. It came closer. The howling got louder, echoing through the trees, through the garden, right outside my window. It was right there, just on the other side of the glass. I could feel it, a presence, something huge and malevolent right outside my house. I screamed. I couldn't help it. Just a raw, terrified scream that ripped through the silence. The howling stopped, just for a moment. Then it started again, closer now, louder, more intense. It felt like it was inside my head, vibrating in my bones. I huddled in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, shaking, sobbing, trapped, completely and utterly trapped. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. I was at its mercy. It howled and howled, circling the house, sometimes close to the windows, sometimes further away, but always there, always present. It went on like that for hours, until the first hint of dawn started to lighten the sky. Then, slowly, gradually, the howling faded, until finally there was silence again, a blessed, blessed silence. When it was properly light, I finally got out of bed, legs like jelly. I went downstairs, opened the curtains, expecting to see, I don't know what, destruction, more footprints, something. But there was nothing. The snow was still there, undisturbed, except for the footprints from the night before. The garden was empty. The woods were silent. Everything looked normal, ordinary, like nothing had happened. But I knew it had. I'd heard it. I'd felt it. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, still there, just out of sight. After that night, I started leaving apples out, just on the back doorstep, by the woods. It was a stupid thing to do, I know, like some kind of offering, but I didn't know what else to do. I felt like I had to do something to appease it. Maybe if I gave it something, it would leave me alone. And it worked, in a weird way. The apples would be gone in the morning, every morning, taken, and for a while nothing else happened. No more knocks, no more pecking, no more howling, just the apples disappearing. Then the other things started. Strange things. Things I still can't explain. I'd put an apple out, and the next morning the apple would be gone, but something else would be there in its place. A smooth grey stone, a piece of bark shaped like a bird. Once, a small twisted twig, like a tiny hand. Little things, insignificant things maybe, but they felt significant, like it was communicating, leaving me gifts or warnings, I didn't know. And then, one morning, instead of an apple, I left out a pear, just to see what would happen. And the next morning, the pear was gone, and in its place, there was a stone. But not just any stone. This one was different. It was dark, almost black, and it was shaped like a pyramid. Perfectly formed, smooth, with sharp edges. It was small, about the size of my thumb, but it felt heavy. Heavier than it should have been, and cold, ice cold, even in the sun. I picked it up, and as soon as I touched it, I felt it. A jolt. Not of electricity, but something deeper, something older. A coldness that went right through me, chilling me to the bone, and a feeling of vastness, of something immense and ancient just beyond my understanding, and a hint of hunger. I dropped the stone like it was burning me. It landed on the doorstep with a dull thud. I stared at it. It just lay there, black and silent in the morning sun, but it felt wrong, profoundly wrong, like something had crossed a line. I haven't left any more apples out since then, and the strange things, they stopped, for now. But I still feel it sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the woods are dark. A feeling of being watched, a prickle on my skin, a sense that something is still out there, waiting. And sometimes I look at that stone. It's still there, in a drawer in my bedroom, that black pyramid, cold and silent. And I wonder, what was it? What is it? What did I bring into my life, into my house, that night in 2015? And will it ever truly leave? I honestly don't know, and that's the scariest part of all, that I don't know, and maybe I never will. Story 4. We unloaded the groceries, the usual stuff, and I let the dogs out back, just like always. We had 2 German shepherds, Duke and Duchess. They loved the snow, usually went tearing around like maniacs in it. But this time, they went out kind of hesitant, sniffing the air like something was off. I didn't think much of it at first, figured maybe they smelled a rabbit or something. But then Duke started to bark, not his usual playful bark, but this deep, guttural bark, the one he used when he was really agitated or scared. Duchess joined in too, and they were both facing the woods behind our yard, barking and growling like crazy. John went out onto the back porch to see what was going on. "Hey, what is it, guys? What did you find?" he called out. They just kept barking, not moving from their spot, just fixed on something in the trees. I came out too, putting down the grocery bags to see if I could spot anything. It was starting to get properly dark now, and the snow was picking up a little. I couldn't see anything in the woods, just the dark shapes of the trees against the white snow. "Must be a deer or something," John said, but even as he said it, he didn't sound too sure. The dog's barking was escalating, turning almost frantic. Then John pointed down at the snow, right at the edge of our yard. "Heather, look at this!" And I saw them, footprints, but not like any footprints I'd ever seen before. They were huge, I mean ridiculously huge, way bigger than any dog print, way bigger than any deer track. These were monstrous. I walked closer and my stomach dropped. They were easily 21 inches long, maybe even more, and really wide too, like almost as wide as they were long. And they weren't like human footprints, not really. They were odd, sort of 3-toed, but the toes were thick and blunt, and the heel part was weirdly rounded and almost bulbous. We just stared at them for a second, both of us silent, the dog still barking like mad. It was like our minds were refusing to process what we were seeing. What made these?" I finally whispered, feeling a chill go right through me that had nothing to do with the cold. John shook his head, his face pale in the porch light. I don't know. Bear? But those don't look like bear tracks." We followed the prints in the snow with our flashlights, our hearts starting to hammer in our chests. They started right at the edge of the woods, just inside the tree line, and they came straight across our backyard, right up to the edge of the patio. And then they just stopped, like abruptly, no footprints leading away, no sign of where whatever made them went. It was like it had walked across our yard and then just vanished into thin air. The dogs were going ballistic now, barking and lunging at the woods, but they wouldn't actually go into the trees. They were scared, I could tell. Usually Duke was fearless. He'd chase anything into the woods, but now he was holding back, whining and backing up a step every time he barked. Duchess was even worse, practically glued to my leg, trembling. That really started to freak me out. Our dogs weren't easily scared, especially not in our own backyard. We got the dogs inside as quickly as we could, and they didn't calm down at all once we were inside. They kept pacing and whimpering, their ears pricked up, like they were still listening for something. John and I went back out, a little braver now that we were together and had flashlights, but the air outside just felt different, heavy, wrong. The snow seemed to fall quieter than usual, if that makes any sense, like it was muffling all other sounds. And the woods just felt darker, more menacing. We walked around the yard again, shining our flashlights everywhere, trying to make sense of those footprints. We checked the perimeter fence, thinking maybe someone was messing with us, but everything was locked and secure. There were no other footprints anywhere, just those huge, weird tracks coming into our yard and then stopping dead. It was like whatever made them just cease to exist when it reached the edge of the patio. Then we heard it. A sound from the woods, not a branch breaking or an animal rustling. It was a whine, low and mournful, like a dog, but way deeper, almost inhuman. It was hard to pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to drift through the trees, echoing oddly in the stillness of the snowy night. We froze, both of us holding our breath, listening. The dogs inside started howling then, joining in with this sound from the woods, their howls full of fear and agitation. It was unsettling, to say the least. John grabbed my hand, his grip tight. "Let's go inside," he whispered, his voice strained. "Now!" We didn't argue. We practically ran back to the house, slamming the door shut behind us and locking it. We went to the windows, peering out into the darkness, trying to see anything. The motion sensor light above the garage suddenly flickered on, bathing the driveway and a section of the yard in harsh white light. Nothing. Just snow falling, the empty driveway, the edge of the woods looking dark and impenetrable. But then, the light flickered again, and again, constantly, like something was setting it off, over and over. "What's going on with the motion light?" I asked, my voice trembling a little. John frowned, looking out the window. "It shouldn't be doing that, nothing's out there." But the light kept flashing on, off, like a strobe, casting weird, jumpy shadows across the snow. We watched it for what felt like forever, just blinking on and off, and the longer it went on, the more freaked out I got. It was like something invisible was moving out there, triggering the sensor, but we couldn't see it. Then we smelled it. A smell that made my stomach churn. It was foul, like rotting meat, but mixed with something else, something sickly sweet and putrid. Like death, but worse. It drifted in through the cracks around the windows, filling the house with this disgusting stench. We both gagged, covering our mouths with our hands. What is that smell?" I choked out, tears welling up in my eyes. John just shook his head, his face green. "I don't know, but I don't like it." The dogs started whining again, whimpering and hiding under the kitchen table, their noses twitching, obviously bothered by the smell too. We opened some windows a crack, trying to get some fresh air in despite the cold, just to get rid of that awful smell. It helped a little, but it was still there, lingering, clinging to the air, and the motion light kept flashing on and off, relentlessly. We didn't sleep much that night. We stayed up on the couch, with the dogs huddled around us, listening to every creak and groan of the house, every rustle of leaves outside. The motion light finally stopped flashing around dawn, and the smell faded a little, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. It hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The next morning, when it was fully light out, we went out into the yard again, armed with more courage in the daylight, but still with a knot of dread in our stomachs. The footprints were still there, just as clear as they'd been the night before, but the snow had stopped, so they stood out starkly against the fresh white surface. We followed them again, hoping to find where they went, to make some sense of it. But they still just stopped at the patio. No other tracks, nothing to explain them. Then we went to check the shed in the backyard, where we kept the cat food and some gardening supplies. We had a stray cat we fed sometimes, and we kept a big bag of dry food in a sealed plastic bin in the shed. John opened the shed door, and we both stared in disbelief. The bin was open, the lid was on the floor, and the entire bag of cat food, a huge bag, was gone. Just gone. No spilled food, no signs of a struggle, just an empty bin and a missing bag of food. "Okay, that's weird," John said slowly, scratching his head. "Did you leave the shed unlocked?" I shook my head. "No, I always lock it. You know I do, because of raccoons getting into the trash." He checked the lock. It was still locked. No sign of forced entry, nothing broken. It was like the cat food had just vanished. Then we remembered the chickens. We had a small coop in the back corner of the yard, with 5 hens that we kept for eggs. We walked over to the coop, and as soon as we got close, we knew something was wrong. It was silent. Usually, the hens were clucking and scratching around even in the winter, but there was no sound coming from the coop. John opened the coop door, and I gasped. All 5 hens were dead, lying on the coop floor, perfectly still. but there wasn't a single mark on them. No blood, no feathers ruffled, no sign of injury at all. They just looked asleep, but still and cold. "What the hell?" John breathed, staring at the dead chickens. "What could have done this, and taken the cat food, and made those tracks?" We were both completely baffled, and honestly really scared now. This wasn't just some weird animal in the woods. This was something different, something inexplicable. We called the police, figuring maybe someone had broken into our shed and killed our chickens, even though it made no sense. The officer came out, looked at the footprints, shrugged, and said it was probably a prank. He barely even glanced at the dead chickens or the missing cat food. He just filled out a report, said they'd keep an eye out, and left. We felt completely dismissed and even more vulnerable. We started talking to our neighbors, asking if they'd seen or heard anything strange. And that's when things got even creepier. Turns out we weren't the only ones. Mrs. Henderson, down the street, said her garbage cans had been raided the same night, even though they were locked in her garage. Mr. Peterson, across the road, said his dog had been acting crazy too, barking at nothing in the woods and refusing to go outside after dark. And then Sean Gregg, who lived a couple of houses over, he stopped us as we were walking the dogs. He was an older guy, kind of quiet, kept to himself mostly, but he looked really concerned. "You folks had any trouble last night?" he asked, looking at us intently. We told him about the footprints, the smell, the motion light, the chickens, the cat food. He listened quietly, nodding slowly. When we were done, he just said, "Yeah, sounds about right." We were confused. "Sounds about right? What do you mean?" John asked. Sean sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "Look," he said, leaning in closer, like he didn't want to be overheard. "I've lived in Perry Township my whole life, and, well, let's just say this isn't the first time things like this have happened around here." He went on to tell us about stories he'd heard over the years, things that people whispered about, but didn't really talk about openly. Strange animal disappearances, weird lights in the woods, livestock found dead for no apparent reason, strange smells, unsettling noises. He said some people claimed to have seen things, shapes moving in the dark, things that weren't quite animal and weren't quite human. He'd even had his own experiences, he admitted, things he couldn't explain, things that had scared him half to death. He told us about one night years ago when he was a kid. He'd been out hunting with his dad in the woods behind his house. They'd heard a sound, a high-pitched screech, like nothing they'd ever heard before. Then they smelled that same foul, sickening smell we'd smelled. His dad had grabbed him and practically dragged him out of the woods, didn't even stop running until they were back inside their house, doors locked and windows bolted. He said his dad never spoke about it again, just acted like it never happened. But Sean never forgot it. He told us all this in a low, serious voice, his eyes never meeting ours directly, like he was embarrassed to be admitting these things out loud. But he was clearly genuinely worried for us. "Just be careful," he said finally. "Keep your dogs inside at night, lock your doors, and maybe don't go wandering around in the woods after dark." Then he just nodded and walked away, leaving us standing there, even more terrified and confused than we'd been before. We lived in that house for another year after that. Nothing quite as dramatic as that first night happened again, but things were different. We were always on edge. Every creak of the house, every rustle in the leaves outside, every shadow in the yard, it all made us jump. The dogs were never quite the same either. They were more skittish, more alert, always watching the woods. We kept the motion lights working. We locked all the doors and windows every night. We never went out in the dark unless we absolutely had to. We never saw those footprints again, never smelled that smell again quite as strong, never found anything else dead or missing. But the feeling of being watched, of something out there, something unknown and terrifying, that feeling never really went away. It was like a shadow hanging over our lives in Perry Township. We eventually moved, not specifically because of that, but it was definitely a factor. We just couldn't shake the unease, the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edge of the woods, something we couldn't see or understand. But that was definitely there, and to this day I still don't know what made those footprints. I don't know what took the cat food or killed the chickens without a mark. I don't know what set off the motion light all night or what made that awful smell. I don't know what Sean Gregg and his dad heard in the woods. I just know that something happened that night. Something real, something terrifying, something that I still can't explain. And sometimes, late at night, when everything's quiet and I hear a dog bark in the distance, I still get that same chill, that same feeling of unease. Like whatever it was, whatever we encountered in Perry Township, it's still out there, somewhere in the dark, watching, waiting. And that, honestly, is the scariest part of all. Story 5. It started back when I was just a kid, probably 10 or 11 years old. We lived out on Beauty Lane, you know, way out in the sticks. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much ever happened, or so we thought. My dad, he was always one for keeping the property clear, especially with the fire hazard in the summers. We were burning brush in the back field, the kind you get when you're clearing out overgrown fence lines and trimming trees. It was a cool evening, almost dark. The fire was going good, crackling away and sending smoke up in the air, smelling like pine and damp earth. I was poking at the fire with a stick, probably making it worse than better, and my dad was tossing branches in. Then we heard it. Bang, bang, bang. Sounded like someone was throwing rocks at the barn. It was a metal roof, so even small pebbles sounded loud as hell. We both froze, looking at each other. There weren't any kids around, not this far out, and certainly not messing around near our barn in the dark. Probably just the fire popping, Sean, Dad said, trying to sound like he believed it, but I saw his eyes were narrowed, looking towards the barn. We stood there for another minute, listening, the fire crackling, crickets chirping, and then bang! Louder this time, right above us. We both jumped. Nah, that ain't no fire pop, I said, my voice a little shaky. Dad grabbed the flashlight he had been using to see what he was doing. Let's go see what it is, he said. But there was a tightness in his jaw that told me he was already getting that uneasy feeling. We walked around the burn pile, keeping the flashlight beam steady in front of us. The air was getting colder now that the sun was really going down. The barn was just across the field, maybe 100 yards, and the field was mostly cleared grass and weeds. Nothing moving. We got to the edge of the field, near the tree line, and Dad stopped. He swept the flashlight across the barn. Nothing, just the metal siding reflecting back the light. Then he aimed it towards the back of the barn, where we parked the old 48-foot trailer we used for storage. That trailer had been sitting there for years. We barely ever used it. And that's when we saw them. 2 red dots, glowing bright in the dark, right behind the trailer. Like eyes. Big eyes, reflecting the flashlight beam right back at us. They weren't animal eyes, you know. Deer eyes shine green or yellow. Raccoon eyes are different too. These were red. Pure red. And they seemed to be watching us. My blood went cold. I remember grabbing onto my dad's arm hard. He went rigid next to me. He slowly raised the flashlight a bit higher, trying to see what was behind those eyes. The beam caught the edge of the trailer, the dusty metal side, and nothing else. Just those 2 red dots hanging there in the darkness behind it. We stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at those eyes. No sound, no movement. Just those 2 red points of light in the pitch black behind the trailer. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen solid. Then just as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. Just vanished. Dad kept the flashlight pointed at the spot, but there was nothing there. Just the trailer, the shadows, and the rustling of leaves in the trees. The silence was deafening after that. He lowered the flashlight slowly, his face pale in the dim light from the dying fire. Did you see that, Sean? He whispered, like he wasn't sure he believed his own eyes. "Yeah, Dad. I saw it," I said, my voice barely a croak. What was it?" He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, son. I really don't." We didn't go back to burning brush that night. We put out the fire quick as we could and went back to the house. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those red eyes again. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That was the first time, but it sure as hell wasn't the last. Things started happening after that, little things at first, but they kept escalating. It was like something had been woken up that night, or maybe we'd just finally noticed it. We started losing things. Not little things, mind you. Big, heavy, impossible to lose things, like tractor implements. Dad had a brush hog, one of those big rotary mowers you pull behind a tractor. Thing weighed a ton. One day, it was just gone. We'd parked it by the equipment shed, and the next morning, poof, vanished. We searched everywhere, the whole property, every field, every shed, every corner of the woods we could get into with the tractor. Nothing. Dad was convinced someone had stolen it, even though who would steal a massive brush hog in the middle of nowhere, and how they'd even haul it off without anyone noticing, made no sense. Then, about a week later, we found it. Sitting in the middle of the backfield, way further out than we'd ever taken it. Just sitting there, like it had been gently placed in the tall grass. No tracks, no signs of it being dragged or moved. It was clean, not a speck of mud on it, even though the ground had been a little damp that week. We were baffled, totally and utterly baffled. We wrote it off as some kind of crazy mistake. Maybe we'd parked it there and just forgot. But we both remembered parking it by the shed, clear as day, and it was just too far away to have been accidentally moved without us realizing it. Then it happened again. This time it was the disc harrow, another massive piece of farm equipment, gone from where we parked it, reappeared a week later in a completely different field, perfectly clean. It was like someone was playing a sick joke on us, but it wasn't funny. It was unsettling, creepy. We started to feel like we were being watched all the time, like there were eyes on us, just out of sight, in the woods, behind the trees, always observing. We'd hear noises at night, rustling in the woods that sounded too big to be deer or raccoons, heavy footsteps that didn't sound like any animal we knew. Dogs in the neighborhood started acting strange, barking at nothing, whimpering, refusing to go outside at night. Years went by. The weird disappearances stopped, but the feeling of being watched never did. We got used to it in a way, tried to ignore it, to explain it away as just our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I think both me and Dad knew there was something off about Beauty Lane. Then, a few years after I graduated high school, things started happening again, but this time they were more aggressive. Our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, lived down the road, maybe half a mile away. Sweet old lady, kept to herself mostly. She lived in a trailer on her property, right by the edge of the woods. One night, she was outside, near her trailer, when something hit her trailer, hard. She said it sounded like a gunshot, scared the living daylights out of her. She ran inside and locked the door, peering out the windows. Then it started again, thump, thump, thump against the side of her trailer. Rocks. Someone was throwing rocks at her trailer. She called the sheriff, scared half to death. Deputy showed up, walked around her property, found nothing, no one around, no signs of anyone being there. He told her it was probably just kids messing around, teenagers being stupid. But Mrs. Henderson was convinced it was something else. She said the rocks were too big to be thrown by kids, and the sound, she said it was just evil sounding. The next night, it happened again. But this time, it was worse. Not just rocks. Someone threw a chunk of asphalt, like from a broken-up road, at her trailer. Thing was huge, must have weighed 20 pounds. It smashed into the side of her trailer, denting the metal and leaving a big scrape. Then came the rocks again, and something else this time. Batteries. Someone was throwing D-cell batteries at her trailer, hard. She was terrified. She ended up sleeping at her daughter's house for a week. She was so scared to stay there alone. We all felt bad for her. Dad and I went over to check on her place, walk around, see if we could see anything. We found some rocks scattered around and a couple of those big D batteries, like someone had just grabbed them out of a flashlight or something. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was like whatever was doing this was just there and then gone, leaving no trace. Around 2004, maybe 2005, I remember it was a cool fall night. I was inside reading. Dad was out on the porch, smoking his pipe. Suddenly he came bursting through the door, his face white as a sheet. Sean, come here, you gotta hear this." I jumped up, thinking something was wrong. "What is it, Dad? What happened?" He dragged me out onto the porch, pointing towards the woods behind our house. "Listen," he hissed. I stood there, straining my ears. The usual night sounds, crickets, owls hooting in the distance, wind rustling the leaves. Then I heard it, faint but clear, a voice calling out, "Help! Help me!" It was a weak, raspy voice, like someone was in pain, barely able to speak. It was coming from the ravine behind our house, down in the woods. The ravine was steep, thick with trees and underbrush. It was easy to get lost down there, especially in the dark. My heart started pounding. "Someone's hurt, Dad," I said, adrenaline rushing through me. "We gotta go check it out." He nodded, his eyes wide. "Get the flashlights, and maybe something else." He went and grabbed his shotgun, unloaded, of course, more for, I don't know, comfort maybe. I grabbed my baseball bat, feeling stupid holding it but still wanting something in my hands. We went down into the ravine, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was cold and damp down there. The woods felt different at night, closed in and menacing. We kept calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there? We heard you?" The voice answered, weak and desperate. "Help. Please. Help me." It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the ravine, near the creek bed. We pushed our way through the undergrowth, branches snapping under our feet. We called out again, following the sound of the voice. It led us deeper and deeper into the woods. The ravine got steeper, the trees thicker, the darkness almost complete, broken only by our flashlight beams dancing through the leaves. We searched for hours, calling, listening, scrambling through the underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks. We got cuts and scratches, our clothes were ripped, we were sweating and freezing at the same time, but we couldn't find anyone. The voice kept calling, leading us on, but whenever we thought we were close, it would move or fade away or just stop. Finally, exhausted and frustrated, we gave up. It was getting late, the sky was starting to lighten in the east. We hadn't found anyone, no sign of anyone being hurt or lost. Just the woods, the darkness, and that haunting voice calling for help. We walked back to the house, silent and shaken. We couldn't explain it. Who was calling for help? Where were they? And why couldn't we find them, even though we'd followed the sound right into the heart of the ravine? The next day, we told our neighbor, Mr. Peterson, about it. He lived on the other side of the woods from us. His property bordered ours on the backside. He was a tough old guy, ex-military, didn't scare easy. We figured maybe he'd heard something too. He listened to our story, his face grim. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I've heard that before." My dad and I looked at each other, surprised. "You have?" Dad asked. "You heard someone calling for help in the ravine?" Mr. Peterson nodded. "Years ago, late at night. Sounded just like you described. Went out looking, same as you. Couldn't find anyone, never could figure out what it was." He shook his head. "Spooky damn woods around here." Spooky damn woods indeed. After that, we didn't go into the ravine at night, not without a really good reason. And we always went armed, even if it was just a flashlight or a walking stick. We didn't know what was out there, but we knew it was something wrong. Then there were the renters. We had an old trailer we sometimes rented out for short periods, to hunters or people just passing through. A young couple rented it for a week that fall, wanted to do some hiking in the area. Seemed like nice enough folks. A few days into their stay, they came to our door, looking spooked. "Mr. Gregg," the guy said, we think something happened to our trailer last night." "What do you mean?" Dad asked, concerned. "Well," the woman said, her voice shaky, "we woke up this morning and there were handprints on the windows, big handprints, like giant hands. We went down to the trailer with them to take a look, and sure enough, there they were. On the outside of the windows, smudged and dusty, were handprints, big, wide, long fingers. Definitely not human hands. They were too big, the fingers too long, the palms too wide, and they were high up on the windows, higher than any normal person could reach without standing on something. The couple was freaked out. They said they hadn't heard anything during the night, but they were both light sleepers. They were convinced someone, or something, had been messing with their trailer while they were asleep. That night, Dad and I stayed up late, watching the trailer from our house. We had binoculars, and Dad had his rifle, just in case. Nothing happened. It was a quiet night. But the next morning, the renters were packed and ready to leave. They said they couldn't stay another night. They were too creeped out. Before they left, they told us something else that really chilled us to the bone. They said that when they were sitting in the trailer that evening, looking out the window at the woods, they saw something in the trees. Eyes, red eyes, watching them from the edge of the field. The same red eyes we'd seen behind the trailer all those years ago. They didn't stick around to describe them in detail, just loaded up and left as fast as they could. We didn't blame them. After that, we stopped renting out the trailer. It just wasn't worth the hassle or the risk. Then came the noises from the woods. We'd been hearing them for years, the rustling, the footsteps, but now they started getting louder, more industrial sounding, like machinery, like something big and heavy moving through the trees. Sometimes it sounded like a bulldozer or some kind of heavy equipment tearing through the forest. Trees snapping, branches breaking, the ground shaking. We'd go out to investigate during the day, but we never found anything. No tracks, no signs of heavy equipment, just broken trees and trampled undergrowth, like something huge had pushed its way through the woods. And the dogs. The neighborhood dogs started disappearing. One by one, they went missing. Our dog, Old Blue, went missing one night. Just gone. No barking, no fighting, just silence. Our neighbor's beagle disappeared the next week. Then another dog down the road. It was like something was picking them off, one by one. Dad and I started keeping our guns loaded at night, and we kept the porch lights on all night long. We felt like we were living in a siege, trapped in our own home, surrounded by something we couldn't see, couldn't understand, but knew was out there, watching, waiting. The closest I ever came to actually seeing it again, after those eyes behind the trailer when I was a kid, was the night my dad had his encounter. It was late, must have been after midnight. I was asleep in my room, and I heard Dad yelling, not just yelling, screaming, like he was in real pain or terrified. I bolted out of bed and ran to the living room. Dad was standing in the middle of the room, breathing hard, his eyes wide, his face pale. He was pointing towards the back door, the door that led to the porch. It was on the porch, he gasped, his voice shaking. Something was on the porch. I rushed to the door, grabbing the shotgun off the wall as I went. I threw the door open and stepped out onto the porch, gun raised. The porch was empty. Just the porch swing swaying gently in the night breeze, the porch light casting a weak circle of light around the steps. "What was it, Dad?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "What did you see?" He was still shaking, pointing at the porch railing. It was right there," he stammered. Leaning over the railing, looking in the window, big, dark, couldn't see its face, but it was big, Sean, real big, and it smelled awful, like rot and dirt. He said he'd been sitting in his chair by the window reading when he'd felt like he was being watched. He looked up, and there it was, right outside the window, leaning over the porch railing, looking right at him. He couldn't make out details, it was too dark, but he said it was massive, dark shape against the night, and that smell. He said it almost made him sick. He screamed, and whatever it was gone, just vanished into the darkness. He hadn't seen it run, hadn't heard it move. It was just there and then not there. We spent the rest of the night sitting up, guns loaded, every nerve on edge. We didn't see or hear anything else, but we both knew, whatever it was, whatever we had been dealing with all these years out on Beauty Lane, was still out there. And it still is. We still hear the noises in the woods, still get that feeling of being watched. The disappearances stopped for a while, the rock throwing stopped. Things have been quieter lately, but quiet doesn't mean gone. It just means waiting, watching, out there, in the woods, on Beauty Lane. And I know deep down, it's still there, waiting for us, waiting for something. And I have absolutely no idea what it is or what it wants. And that's the part that keeps me up at night. Just the not knowing. Story 6. We piled into Mark's old Silverado, the one that always smelled faintly of dog and stale beer, but we loved it. There was me, Mark, of course, then Danny and the twins, Chris and Kevin. 5 of us, plus our dogs. Blue, Rebel, Roscoe, Duke and little Penny. Penny wasn't exactly built for coon hunting. She was Mark's beagle mix, kind of goofy and always happy, but she loved being out there with the pack, just as much as the rest of them. We drove for what felt like forever, deeper and deeper into the backwoods. Morgan County is pretty wild in places, and the closer we got to Burr Oak, the more the trees just seemed to close in around us. The road turned into this busted-up dirt track, all potholes and loose gravel. Mark was complaining about his shocks the whole time, but we were all too pumped up to really care. We were aiming for this spot near East Branch Road. Danny had marked it on his GPS as being close to some old abandoned homestead. He figured that's where the coons would be hanging out, lots of places to hide and get into trouble. As we drove, the woods just kept getting darker, even with the truck headlights cutting through the night. It wasn't just regular dark, it was thick dark, like it was swallowing the light whole. You could feel it, a different kind of quiet out there too. Not just peaceful quiet, but empty. We finally bumped our way onto this even worse track, barely more than a deer trail it seemed, leading towards where Danny said the old house was. You couldn't see anything through the trees except shadows and the occasional glint of moonlight through the leaves. It was the kind of place that just made the hairs on your neck stand up a little, even before anything happened. We parked the truck as far as we could go and piled out, letting the dogs out of their crates in the back. They were instantly on high alert, sniffing and whining, already catching scents we couldn't even imagine. Excitement was buzzing in the air. This was it. We clipped on their tracking collars, turned on our headlamps, and Danny gave the signal. "All right, boys, let's go get us some coons." The dogs took off like rockets, their barks echoing through the woods. That's always the best part, hearing them get on a scent, their baying just charging you up. We followed behind, flashlights bouncing off the trees, calling out to the dogs. It was a clear night, stars out bright, but down under the tree canopy it was almost complete black, except for our beams of light. Within minutes, Blue, who was our best lead dog, started to really howl, that deep, determined bark that meant he was onto something good. The others joined in, their barks getting faster and more excited. "They got one treed already," Kevin yelled, grinning. We were all moving faster now, pushing through brush, branches whipping at our faces, the sound of the dogs pulling us forward. Then it happened. Right as we were getting close to where the dogs were going nuts, we heard it. It wasn't a normal animal sound, not a coyote yip, not a deer bleat, nothing we'd ever heard in the woods before. It was a scream, but not human. Higher pitched, sharper, and laced with something else. Something raw and terrifying. It ripped through the night, echoing off the trees, and cut right through the dogs barking, silencing them instantly. I swear my heart stopped beating for a second. It wasn't just loud, it was close. Way too close. It sounded like it was right there, maybe just beyond the thickest part of the woods, just yards away from where our dogs were. We all froze, flashlights pointed in every direction, but all we saw were trees and shadows. The silence that followed was deafening. The dogs had stopped barking completely, not even a whimper, just nothing. Then, under the silence, we heard it. A growl. But again, not like any growl I'd ever heard from a dog, or even a bear or something. This growl was deep, guttural, like something huge, something ancient, was right there, and it was angry. It sounded like it was moving too, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and this low, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate in your chest. It was coming from the same direction as the scream, getting closer to where our dogs had been. Adrenaline surged through me, but it wasn't the excited adrenaline of the hunt anymore. This was pure, icy fear. I remember looking at Mark, and his face was white under the beam of his headlamp. Danny's eyes were wide, staring into the darkness. Even the twins, who were usually joking and fearless, looked petrified. What was that?" Chris stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Nobody answered. We were all too stunned to speak, just listening to the growl getting closer. The woods felt different now. Hostile, like we had walked into something we weren't supposed to see. Something ancient and dark had woken up and was pissed. The growl was closer now, definitely moving towards where the dogs had been. And still, not a sound from our dogs. They weren't barking, they weren't whining, they weren't even whimpering. Just silence. A heavy, terrifying silence. That's when instinct took over. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was just pure gut-level survival kicking in. I didn't even think about the dogs, didn't think about the coon hunt, didn't think about anything except getting out of there. I turned and ran. I don't even know if I said anything to the others. I just bolted back the way we came, flashlight beam bouncing wildly through the trees. I heard the others behind me crashing through the undergrowth, equally panicked. We ran like hell. Branches tore at my clothes. I tripped over roots, almost fell a dozen times, but I just kept running, adrenaline pumping, heart hammering against my ribs. We didn't stop running until we burst out of the woods and back onto the dirt track where we parked the truck. We scrambled into the cab, everyone tripping over each other, fumbling for seatbelts, doors slamming. Mark jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roared to life, and he floored it, tires spitting gravel. We didn't say a word to each other the entire drive back down that bumpy track and onto the main road. We were all just breathing hard, chests heaving, still terrified. It felt like we were being chased, even after we were back on paved road, back in what felt like civilization. That scream, that growl, it was burned into my brain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Danny spoke, his voice shaky. What the hell was that? No one had an answer. We racked our brains, trying to come up with something, anything that could explain what we heard. But there was nothing. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a mountain lion, it wasn't a coyote, it wasn't anything natural. The silence came back, heavier this time, filled with the unspoken horror of what we had all experienced. And then, the guilt started to creep in. The dogs. We had left our dogs back there. We drove in silence the rest of the way back, finally pulling up at Mark's place. We just sat there in the truck, engine idling, nobody moving. "We gotta go back," I said finally. The words felt heavy, tasted like ash in my mouth. "Are you crazy?" Kevin said, his voice still tight with fear. "Go back there. After that?" "We can't just leave the dogs," I said, my voice stronger this time. "They're our dogs." We argued for a bit, the fear battling with the guilt and responsibility we felt for leaving our dogs behind. But we knew we couldn't just leave them, not knowing what happened to them, if they were hurt, if they were worse. We didn't sleep a wink that night, just sat around Mark's kitchen table, the silence broken only by nervous pacing and the occasional hushed whisper about what we'd heard. We kept jumping at every little sound, every creak of the house, every bark of a distant dog. As soon as the first hint of dawn started to lighten the sky, we were back in the truck, driving back to Morgan County. The drive was agonizing. Every mile felt like 10. The woods didn't seem quite as menacing in the daylight, but the memory of last night was still hanging heavy in the air. We parked the truck in the same spot, hearts pounding, and stepped out into the pale morning light. The woods looked different in the daytime, ordinary, almost peaceful, but the fear was still there, coiled tight in my stomach. We called for the dogs, yelling their names, whistling, but there was no response. Just the sound of birds chirping and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was like they had vanished into thin air. Danny pulled out his phone, fumbling with the tracking app. "Okay," he said, his voice strained. "Let's see. Rebel, Roscoe, Blue, Duke, Penny. Okay, good. They're all still showing up on the GPS. They're close." He pointed at the screen. "According to this, they're right here, but that doesn't make sense." He was looking at a spot just off the side of the track, close to where we had parked. There was nothing there but trees and some thick undergrowth. We started to search the area, calling the dogs again, pushing through bushes, looking under logs, but nothing. Then Mark yelled, "Hey, wait a minute!" He was standing by the side of the road, pointing down. "Look at this!" We gathered around. There, almost hidden by weeds and overgrown grass, was a culvert, a concrete pipe, maybe 3 feet wide, running under the road, the kind they use for drainage. Danny checked his phone again. "The signal is coming from right there, inside that pipe." It was crazy. Why would the dogs be in a culvert? They weren't the kind to crawl into tight spaces, especially not all 5 of them together. And after that last night, it just didn't make any sense. Hesitantly, Mark peered into the dark opening of the culvert. "Hey, anybody in there?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. Silence. Then a faint whimper, just barely audible. "Wait, I think I hear something," Chris said, leaning closer. We all held our breath, straining to hear, and then we heard it again. A low, pathetic whine coming from deep inside the culvert. "It's them!" Kevin yelled. "They're in there!" We scrambled to the opening, peering into the darkness. It was too dark to see anything, but the whimpering was definitely coming from inside. Danny pulled out his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness inside the pipe, and there they were, all 5 of them, huddled together at the far end of the culvert, pressed against the concrete, their eyes wide and terrified in the beam of the flashlight. They were trembling uncontrollably. We called to them gently, reassuringly, but they didn't move. They just stared at us, whimpering, their bodies shaking. It was like they were frozen in terror. Slowly, cautiously, we crawled into the culvert one by one until we reached them. They didn't run, they didn't bark, they didn't even wag their tails. They just stayed huddled together, their bodies stiff with fear. We reached out slowly, gently, and started to coax them out. One by one, we managed to get them to come to us, pulling them out of the culvert and back into the daylight. They were physically okay. No visible injuries, no blood, nothing broken. But they were different. Their eyes were vacant, their tails tucked tight between their legs, their bodies still trembling. They wouldn't bark, wouldn't even whimper much. They just huddled close to us, shivering, their eyes darting around nervously. We got them back in their crates, loaded them into the truck, and drove home in silence. The whole way back, the dogs just sat in their crates, trembling, staring blankly ahead. It's been months now. The dogs are physically fine. They eat, they sleep, they go through the motions, but they're not the same. They're quieter, jumpier. Loud noises still make them cower. They don't hunt with the same enthusiasm. Sometimes late at night I swear I can hear them whimpering in their sleep. We've tried to understand what happened. We've talked about it a million times, gone over every detail, tried to find some explanation for that scream, that growl, for the sheer terror that silenced our dogs, but we got nothing. It's like something unexplainable happened out there, something we weren't meant to see, something that scared our dogs so badly it broke something inside them. We haven't been back to Morgan County since, haven't even talked about going back. The thought of those woods, that silence, that scream, it still chills me to the bone. I still have nightmares about it sometimes, waking up in a cold sweat, hearing that growl echoing in my ears. I don't know what it was we heard that night. I don't know what was out there in those woods, and honestly, I don't think I ever want to find out. Some things are better left unknown, buried in the darkness of those woods, hidden in the silence, waiting for the next unsuspecting fool to wander too close. All I know is, whatever it was pure evil, and it almost got us all. Story 7. It was May of '82. Me and Unabia, we were fresh out of basic brand spanking new privates. They shipped us out to Fort Wainwright up in Alaska, but before we even got properly settled in, they pulled us for some specialized training down in California. Engineering stuff, building bridges, fortifications, the kind of grunt work engineers need to practice in real terrain. Redwood Creek, Humboldt County, middle of nowhere. They called this training area the Lost Fortress in the Woods. Sounds dramatic, I know, but trust me, after you've been out there for a few days, Lost Fortress feels pretty accurate. Just miles and miles of dense redwood forest, towering trees blocking out the sun, even in the daytime. Spooky as hell, even without what happened to me. We were there for about a week doing drills, getting used to the equipment. Hard work, long days. But this particular day, they told Unabia and me we were assigned night watch at one of the outer posts. Some small fire base they used for advanced exercises. Isolated, that's for sure. They told us it was just a routine security detail, nothing to worry about. Famous last words, right? Around dusk, they loaded us into the back of a Humvee. Not the fancy ones they have now. This was an older model, open top, canvas roof. The driver, Sergeant Miller, was a good guy, kind of quiet but solid. He just drove, didn't say much. As we got further into the woods, the light got weaker, swallowed up by the trees. The air got colder too, even though it was supposed to be May. You could smell the damp earth, the pine needles, that raw green smell of heavy forest. It's hard to describe, but it gets under your skin, makes you feel small. I was sitting on the tailgate, facing backwards, just watching the world blur by. Unabia was in the seat next to the driver, quieter than usual. Unabia, he was a big guy, Samoan, built like a tank, solid muscle, usually cracking jokes, laughing. But today, he was quiet, almost nervous. I figured he was just as thrilled as I was to be spending the night in the middle of nowhere with nothing but shadows for company. We turned off the main dirt road onto an even smaller track, barely more than a path. Branches scraping the sides of the Humvee, the engine whining a bit as it climbed uphill. That's when it happened. We rounded a bend in the track, slow, maybe 10, 15 miles an hour. And there, in the beam of the headlights, something moved. It was at a fork in the road, a small track splitting off to the left, barely visible. Just for a split second, it was illuminated in the headlights. I blinked. I thought I was seeing things. Just tiredness, the shadows playing tricks. But no, it was there. It was huge, definitely taller than a man. I'd guess 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Broad shoulders, thick neck, long arms. It was crossing the track from left to right, going into the denser woods on the other side. The color, that's what I remember most vividly. Not quite brown, not quite gray. More like a pale, dusty tan, almost like cork, that rough, muted color. It was covered in something, fur maybe? Or really coarse hair? Hard to tell in the brief flash of headlights. But the face that I saw, it wasn't an animal. It was human-like in a way, but not human. Broader face, flatter nose, and the eyes, big dark eyes, and they were fixed right on me. It just stopped moving as the headlights hit it, standing in the middle of the track, facing directly at me. For maybe 2-3 seconds it just stared. It was like time slowed down. I could see every detail in those eyes. They were intense, intelligent somehow, and there was something else there, something calculating. Hard to explain. It was like it was assessing me, figuring me out in that split second. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. It just stepped into the trees on the other side of the track and vanished. No sound, just gone. I was frozen, staring at the spot where it had been, my heart pounding in my chest. Sergeant Miller hadn't stopped the Humvee. He'd just kept driving, probably didn't even see it. Or if he did, he didn't react. Maybe he was used to weird stuff out here. I don't know. Did you see that? I stammered, turning to Unabia. He was pale. His eyes were wide. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Yeah, he breathed. Yeah, I saw it. The rest of the ride to the post was silent. Heavy silence. You could cut the tension with a knife. Sergeant Miller dropped us off, handed us the radio, the field rations, a couple of canteens, and a box of ammo for the M16s we were carrying. He gave us a quick rundown of the patrol perimeter, pointed to the pre-dug foxholes, told us to stay alert, standard stuff. Then he turned the Humvee around and drove back the way we came, disappearing into the trees. And then we were alone, just the two of us, surrounded by trees, in the pitch black of the redwood forest night. No moon, no stars visible through the thick canopy, just black, and the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, the distant hooting of an owl. But it all sounded different now. Everything felt amplified, charged with a new kind of dread. We set ourselves up in the foxholes, facing outwards. Unabia took the first watch. We were supposed to rotate every 2 hours, but I couldn't shake what I had seen. That thing. What was that, Unabia? I finally asked, keeping my voice low, almost a whisper. He was sitting hunched in his foxhole, his rifle across his lap, scanning the darkness. He didn't answer right away. Then, he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent, I don't know, John, but back home, we have stories of things, ancient things, that live in the mountains, in the forests. Like monsters? I asked, trying not to sound like a complete idiot. He turned his head to look at me, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of the radio dial. Not monsters, exactly, he said. More guardians. Spirits of the land, old ones. Some tribes, they say, they can take different forms. Animal, human, whatever they need to be. I didn't know what to say to that. I was raised in the city, never really thought about stuff like that. But hearing Unabia talk about it, with that kind of conviction in his voice, it made my skin crawl. You think that's what we saw? I asked. He shrugged, a heavy, slow movement. Could be. Something like that. Something powerful. Something old. We sat in silence for a while. The forest noises seemed to press in on us, louder now, more menacing. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. Every snapping twig sounded like something breaking through the undergrowth. I kept replaying the image of that creature in my mind. Those eyes. That look it gave me. It wasn't just fear I felt then. It was recognition, like it saw something in me too. Something significant? It's hard to explain. It's like it wasn't just looking at me, it was looking into me. The feeling that stayed with me, even after it was gone, was that it knew I had seen it. It knew I was there. And that felt deliberate. Like it had shown itself on purpose. Unabia's watch ended, and it was my turn to stay awake. He went to his sleeping bag, curled up in his foxhole, trying to get some rest. but I doubted either of us would get much sleep that night. The hours crawled by. I was constantly scanning the tree line, my rifle held tight, safety off, finger hovering over the trigger. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made me jump. The wind picked up a little, rustling the leaves in the canopy above, making eerie whispering noises. I kept seeing those eyes in my mind, those dark, intense eyes, and the feeling that I was being watched, even when I couldn't see anything. It was like the whole forest was alive, aware and focused on us, on me especially. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, even though it wasn't that cold out. It was more than just being scared. It was a deep, primal dread. Like something ancient was close by, something powerful, something not human. At one point I thought I heard something moving in the trees just beyond the edge of our perimeter. Heavy footsteps, like something big moving through the undergrowth. Slow, deliberate footsteps, not running, not sneaking, just moving. I gripped my rifle tighter, aimed it in the direction of the sound, my heart pounding in my ears. "Unabia!" I hissed, loud enough to wake him. "Unabia! Wake up! I hear something." He was up in an instant, grabbing his rifle, peering into the darkness. "Where?" he whispered. "Over there," I pointed, my hand shaking slightly. "In the trees. Listen." We both stood still, holding our breath, straining our ears. The wind had died down and the forest was quieter now, almost too quiet. And then we heard it again. A heavy footstep, then another. Closer now. Whatever it was getting closer to our position. We stood back to back, rifles raised, scanning the darkness, trying to pinpoint the sound. The footsteps kept coming, slow, steady, like something large and heavy moving through the trees without trying to hide. The tension was unbearable. My muscles were tense. My mouth was dry. I felt like I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. This wasn't just some animal. This was different. This was purposeful. The footsteps stopped just outside our perimeter. So close now, I felt like I could reach out and touch whatever was out there. We were both frozen, not daring to breathe, waiting for something. And then silence. Complete silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animal sounds, just nothing. Just the heavy, oppressive silence of the redwood forest night. We waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Still silence. We scanned the darkness, our eyes straining to see anything, any movement, any shape in the shadows. But there was nothing. After what felt like forever, Unabia lowered his rifle slightly. Maybe it's gone," he whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice still shaky. "I don't think so. I think it's still out there." And I was right. I could feel it. That feeling of being watched, that sense of something just beyond the edge of sight. It was still there, just waiting. We stayed on high alert for the rest of the night, rotating watches, jumping at every sound, our nerves frayed. But nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more sounds, just the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched. Finally, dawn started to break. A faint grey light filtering through the trees, slowly pushing back the darkness. As the light grew stronger, the tension started to ease a little bit. The forest didn't seem quite so menacing in the daylight, not quite so alive. When the Humvee finally came to pick us up, we were both exhausted, drained. Sergeant Miller didn't say anything, just nodded, like he expected us to be in rough shape. We climbed into the back, and he drove us back to base camp. We didn't talk about it. Not in the Humvee, not at breakfast, not for days. We just went back to our drills, our training, trying to pretend like nothing had happened. But it had. Something had changed. I never told anyone else what I saw. I figured they wouldn't believe me, or they'd just laugh. Unabia, he never mentioned it either. But we both knew. We both knew what we had seen, or at least what we thought we had seen. And sometimes, late at night, when it's quiet and dark, I still think about those eyes, those big dark eyes staring at me from the edge of the redwood forest. And I wonder, what was it? What did it want? And why did it look at me like that? Like it knew something I didn't. I never went back to Redwood Creek after that training exercise, got stationed somewhere else, did my time, got out. But that night in the lost fortress in the woods, it's still with me. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can almost smell the damp earth, the pine needles, and feel that cold, heavy dread creeping back in. And I swear, sometimes, just sometimes, I can still feel those eyes on me, even now. Story 8. It was supposed to be a training exercise. Just us 5, old military buddies, out by the Nisqually River, February of '66. Fort Jasper was right there, casting a shadow over everything, but we were off the base, supposed to be doing some survival thing. Sergeant Tremble Ron, he was leading it. He'd always been about toughing it out, even after retirement. We were tracking towards the river, maybe hoping to snag some fish. It was cold, biting cold, that February air hitting you right in the lungs. The kind of cold that makes the woods quiet, everything sort of hushed and still. We were all ex-military, so we weren't exactly chatty types anyway, but this cold, it just clamped down on any desire to talk. Just boots crunching on frozen leaves, and the wind whispering through the trees. We got closer to the riverbank. Ron was in front, me right behind him. Then Johnson, Davies and Morales bringing up the rear. We were spaced out, not exactly combat formation, but just enough space that if one guy stumbled, he wouldn't take the whole line down. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a shape, down by the river's edge, near the water, bent over. We all froze. Deer, bear. You get jumpy out in the woods, especially near Fort Jasper. You hear stories, rumors. But we were trained men. We knew to assess, identify. Ron signaled to halt, hand up, slow and deliberate. We all stopped, held our breath almost. Whatever it was down there, it was big, bulkier than any deer I ever saw. Dark, sort of crouched, like it was drinking from the river, or maybe fishing, who knows. Then it started to move. Slowly at first. It was rising up, not like an animal getting to its feet. This was different. It straightened, unfolding like something unreal. And as it came up, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. My mind was screaming at me, bear, gotta be a bear. But bears don't stand like that. Bears are lower, clumsier. This thing was vertical, completely upright, like a man. Except it wasn't a man, not even close. It was covered in hair, thick, matted, reddish-brown hair. Everywhere, except for its face and its hands. When it fully stood, it was enormous, taller than any man I'd ever seen. I'm 6 feet even, maybe a bit more with my boots on. This thing towered over me. 2.5, maybe 3 meters easily. I couldn't properly judge, my brain was scrambling. It just stood there at the edge of the river, maybe 20-30 yards away. Knees slightly bent but upright as a tree. And it looked at us, I mean really looked at us. I'll never forget those eyes. Dark, deep set, but intelligent. Not like an animal's eyes. There was something behind them, something watching, thinking. It wasn't hostile, not in that first moment, just intensely curious, like we were the strange things, not it. We were frozen. Every muscle in my body was locked up tight. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, like a drum solo gone wild. I wanted to move, to run, to scream, to do something. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, staring. We all were. It just stared back. For what felt like forever. Time stretched out, twisted. I don't know how long it really was, maybe only seconds, maybe minutes, but it felt like hours. Then, without a sound, without a warning, it moved. It just turned, smooth and quick for something that size, and walked right into the river. The Nisqually in February is ice cold, bone-chilling. We were all bundled up in our warmest gear and still feeling the bite. This thing just walked into it, didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. The water was up to its waist almost immediately, and it started to wade deeper. The current there is strong, even in winter, but it didn't seem to bother it at all. It moved with purpose, swimming now, not wading anymore, powerfully stroking through the water. And it was fast. For something so big, it was incredibly fast in the water. It cut through the river like a motorboat, leaving a wake behind it. We watched, dumbstruck, as it swam to the other bank. It climbed out on the far side, shaking itself like a dog, sending water droplets flying, and then it just stood there again. On the other bank, in the trees, but still clearly visible, looking at us. It stayed there for, I don't know, 10 minutes, maybe more, just watching. Its head turned slightly, studying each of us in turn, I think. It was hard to tell with the distance, with the trees, but it felt like it was examining us, figuring us out. There was no aggression, no snarling, no roaring, nothing like that, just observation, intense, unwavering observation. And that was maybe the most unsettling thing. It wasn't acting like a wild animal scared or threatened. It was considering us, its face. I tried to get a good look. It was mostly bare of hair, like its hands were, kind of a fleshy, pinkish color. Broad nose, flat almost, thick lips jutting out, no real neck to speak of, head just sitting right on its shoulders. The brow was heavy, the eyes deep set under that brow ridge. It was ape-like in a way, but more intelligent, more aware, more human-like but twisted wrong. And the size of its hands, huge, thick fingers. I could imagine those hands crushing bones, tearing flesh, but they just hung at its sides, relaxed. No clenched fists, no threat displays, just watching. Johnson was the first to break the silence, whispering, almost scared to speak. What the hell was that? Nobody answered, because nobody knew. We were all veterans. We'd seen some shit. We'd been shot at, bombed, seen men die. We'd faced down enemy soldiers, been in hand-to-hand combat. But nothing, in our training, nothing in our experience, prepared us for this. Davies was pale as a ghost. Bear, some kind of deformed bear. He didn't sound convinced, and neither was I. I've seen bears. I've hunted bears. That wasn't a bear, not even close. Morales just shook his head, speechless. Ron, Sergeant Tremble. He was the one who was supposed to have all the answers. Ron, the tough guy, the leader. He just stood there, staring at the opposite bank, mouth slightly open, eyes wide. He looked lost, like he'd seen something that broke his understanding of the world. Finally, Ron spoke, voice rough like he hadn't used it in hours, not seconds. I don't know. Ron Tremble, admitting he didn't know something. That was something else entirely. That told me everything I needed to know and nothing at all. We stood there for a few more minutes, maybe, just watching it. It didn't move, just watched us back. Then, slowly, almost casually, it turned and walked into the trees on the other side of the river. And it was gone, vanished, just like that, like it had never been there at all. Except we knew it had. We'd all seen it. We'd all felt it. That cold, deep, primal fear that crawled under your skin and set your teeth on edge. We waited. We stood there, frozen again, even after it was gone, waiting for it to come back, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Just the river flowing, the wind whispering in the trees, the cold pressing in. After a long time, Ron finally moved, turned to us, slowly. His face was pale, drawn. "Okay," he said, his voice still rough. "Okay, let's head back." We didn't argue. Nobody said a word. We just turned around and walked back the way we'd come, in silence. The woods felt different now, empty, but charged, like something was still watching us, even though we couldn't see it anymore. We walked back to the base, the whole way in silence. No one spoke about what we'd seen. Not a word. It was like some unspoken agreement had formed between us, right there on the bank of the Nisqually. We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, and we weren't going to talk about it. Back at Fort Jasper, everything was normal. People going about their day, orders being barked, trucks rolling, the usual military bustle. It felt surreal, like we'd stepped out of reality for a while and then stepped back in. But everything had shifted, just slightly, subtly wrong. We went our separate ways after debriefing with Ron about the training exercise. He kept it brief, generic, said we'd completed the objectives, no issues, no mention of it. I went back to my barracks, showered, tried to eat something, but I couldn't. My stomach was twisted in knots. My hands were still shaking slightly. I kept seeing those eyes in my mind. That face, that immense, hairy form. I lay in my bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it, trying to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination, anything but what it so clearly was. But I knew what I'd seen. We all did. I never spoke about it to anyone, not for years. Not to my wife, not to my kids, not to anyone. It was too unbelievable, too insane. Who would believe it? 5 ex-military guys, supposedly trained observers, scared shitless by... What? A monster? A creature out of myth? It just didn't fit, it didn't make sense. And that's what scared me the most. Not the creature itself, not the size, not the look in its eyes, but the fact that it defied explanation. It broke the rules. It shattered the world as I knew it. Years went by, decades. I left the military, got a job, raised a family, lived a normal life, or as normal as I could. But it was always there, in the back of my mind. That image, that feeling. The cold fear, the stunned silence, the impossible sight. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and dark, I think about it again. I wonder if the others think about it too. Ron, Johnson, Davies, Morales. Are they haunted by it too? Do they ever talk about it amongst themselves? Probably not. We were trained to keep our mouths shut. And sometimes I look out at the woods near my house and I wonder if it's still out there, whatever it was. Out there in the wild places, watching, waiting, existing, just beyond our understanding. I still can't explain it. I don't know what we saw that day by the Nisqually River, but I know what we felt. And that feeling, that raw, primal fear, that chilling sense of the unknown, that's real, and it stays with you, forever. Even now, all these years later, just thinking about it, it still sends a shiver down my spine. And I still don't know what the hell it was. I just saw it. And that's enough to keep me awake some nights. That's enough to make me look twice at shadows in the woods. Even now, even after all this time, it's like a part of me is still standing there on that riverbank, frozen in February cold, staring across the water at something I could never have imagined existed, and a part of me never left. Story 9. So I wandered off. Not far, just enough to feel like I wasn't breathing everyone else's air. Found a little clearing. Moss everywhere, thick and green like a carpet, smelled damp and earthy. It was late, the kind of late where the sky isn't really dark yet, but all the color has drained out of it, just shades of gray and deep blue filtering through the leaves. I lit a cigarette, Marlboro Red, the smell cutting through the damp air for a second before fading into the trees. I'd packed a simple dinner, some sea rations, the usual tasteless garbage. Started messing with the can, trying to pry it open with my P38. That little can opener they give you that feels like it'll break your fingers before it opens anything. Sounded loud in the quiet. The crack of metal tearing, then silence again, just the forest breathing around me. That's when it started. This feeling. You know it, right? The prickling on the back of your neck, the hairs on your arms standing up. Like someone just walked into the room, even though you're alone. Only I wasn't in a room, I was out in the goddamn woods. It wasn't just a feeling either. It was stronger, like being stared at. Like something was watching me, really watching, focusing in. I froze with the can halfway open, lighter still in my other hand. Took a drag of the cigarette, trying to act casual, trying to tell myself it was just nerves. Being alone in the dark woods does that to you, right? Animals, probably. Deer, maybe a bear if I was really unlucky. Nothing to freak out about. But the feeling didn't go away. It got worse. Heavier, like whatever was watching was getting closer, or bolder. It wasn't just looking anymore. It was present. I could feel it in the silence, in the way the shadows seemed to deepen around the edges of the clearing. Slowly, real slow, I turned my head, kept my body still, just turned my head to the left, where the thickest part of the woods was. My eyes struggled to adjust in the dim light. Just trees, shadows, patches of moonlight filtering through, nothing, right? Then I saw it, or rather I saw them, eyes, glowing but not like animal eyes reflecting light back at you. These were red, deep, blood red. And they weren't blinking, weren't moving, just fixed on me. My heart slammed against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to yell, to do something, anything to break that frozen moment. But I couldn't move. I was glued to the spot, staring into those eyes. Slowly, my vision started to adjust, or maybe whatever it was, stepped a little further into the edge of the clearing. I started to see more than just the eyes. Shape, a massive shape, leaning against a tree trunk. Ancient tree, huge, twisted, and this thing, it was even bigger. It was tall. God, so tall. Taller than any man, taller than anything I'd ever imagined seeing outside of a goddamn circus freak show. It was leaning against the tree, almost casual, like it was just taking a break, watching the sunset or something. Except it wasn't sunset, and it was watching me. As my eyes got used to the dark, more details came into focus. It was humanoid, definitely. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head, but distorted. Everything stretched and elongated. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees, which were bent, propped against the tree. Its legs were thick, powerful looking, even in the dim light. And its torso, it was strangely slender. Not bulky like a bear, not thick-necked like a bull. Slender, almost graceful in a terrifying way. The fur, covered in fur, dark fur, matted and coarse-looking. And its face. I couldn't make out much detail in the shadows, but the shape was there. Heavy brow, long snout, but not like an animal. Not like a bear, not like an ape. Something else, something in between, or maybe something beyond. And those eyes, still those damn red eyes, they weren't angry, weren't aggressive, just intense, focused, like they were looking right through me, seeing something behind my eyes, something inside my skull. I swallowed, trying to get spit into my dry mouth. My hands were shaking, but somehow I kept the cigarette in my mouth, didn't even drop the half-open can of sea rations, stupid maybe, but I just stared back. Time stopped. I know it did. Or maybe it just stretched, warped, became something else entirely. I stood there, frozen, staring at this creature. Bigfoot. That's the only word that came into my mind even then. Bigfoot. Like something out of those cheesy magazines you see at the checkout. But this wasn't a magazine. This was real. This was happening. And the silence. It was so complete. Not a bird call, not a rustle of leaves, nothing. Just the heavy silence of the woods and the weight of those red eyes on me. I don't know how long we stood there like that, locked in that silent stare down. Minutes, hours, it felt like forever. My legs started to ache from standing still. My lungs burned for another breath of air, but I couldn't break the gaze. I was terrified. Yeah, deep down in my gut I was terrified. But there was something else too. Fascination, a weird kind of awe. It was magnificent in its own horrifying way. This creature, this thing, shouldn't exist, but it was there, right there in front of me, and the serenity. That's the strangest part. Those eyes, they were red, like blood, but there was no malice in them, no threat, just calm, serene, like it was observing me, studying me, but not judging, not hating, just watching, understanding maybe. It wasn't the monster I expected, not roaring, not charging, not angry, just there, silent, still, watching. Finally, something shifted, not in it, but in me. A tiny twitch in my fingers, a slow blink of my eyes, and the spell broke. Just like that. The tension didn't disappear completely, but it eased. I could breathe again. My muscles started to unclench. I took another drag from my cigarette, the smoke tasting like ash now, but somehow grounding me, bringing me back to normal, to reality. Or what I thought was reality before I saw this. I didn't move, didn't make a sudden sound, just kept my movements slow, deliberate. I lowered my lighter, closed the can of sea rations, and put them both in my pocket. Slowly, carefully, I backed away. One step, then another, keeping my eyes locked on those red eyes, still watching me from the shadows. I backed up until I bumped into a tree behind me, solid, real tree bark against my back. A small comfort. I stayed there, leaning against the tree, still watching it, still being watched. It didn't move, didn't follow, just stayed there, leaning against its tree, its red eyes fixed on me. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it started to fade back into the shadows. It didn't run, didn't even really move. It just blended in, melded with the darkness of the woods until it was just a shadow among shadows, and then nothing. Just the red eyes, hanging in the dark for a moment longer, like embers in the night. And then they were gone too. Just darkness, silence, the woods, like it had never been there. I stood there for a long time after that, leaning against that tree, breathing hard, listening to the frantic pounding of my own heart. The cigarette had burned down to the filter, scorching my fingers, and I didn't even notice. I dropped it, crushed it under my boot heel. The forest was still silent, but it felt different now, charged, like something had shifted in the air, something invisible, something profound. I wasn't alone anymore. Not really, even though I was the only one in the clearing. The woods felt occupied, watched. Even without the red eyes, I knew something was still out there. Somewhere. I didn't finish my dinner, couldn't eat, couldn't think about food. All I could think about were those eyes. That silent, massive figure in the woods. Bigfoot. It had been Bigfoot, no doubt in my mind. I walked back to camp, slow, every nerve on high alert, scanning the trees, half expecting to see those red eyes again, watching me from the darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I got back to the tents, to the noise and the lights, and it felt unreal, like I was stepping back into a different world, a fake world. The guys were still up, playing cards, smoking, joking around, everything normal, too normal, like nothing had happened. And I couldn't tell them. Could you imagine? Hey guys, you won't believe what I just saw out in the woods. Bigfoot. Yeah, seriously, Bigfoot, red eyes and everything. They'd laugh me out of the camp. Or worse, they'd think I'd finally cracked. Stress of training, they'd say. Heat stroke, dehydration, who knows what other military bullshit they'd come up with. So I kept quiet, didn't say a word, just crawled into my sleeping bag, lay there staring at the canvas of the tent above me, seeing those red eyes in the darkness behind my eyelids, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince myself it was a dream, a hallucination, anything but real. But it felt real. Too real. The silence, the weight of the stare, the sheer size of it. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't. I knew it in my gut. I never went back to that clearing, never wandered off alone again in those woods. Not at night, not even during the day. I stayed close to camp, stayed with the guys, kept myself surrounded by noise and people and the mundane routine of military life. But the image, it never left me. Those red eyes, that silent, watchful figure in the shadows. Sometimes, Even now, decades later, when I'm alone, in the quiet, I feel that prickling on the back of my neck. And I remember the silence, the red eyes, the feeling of being watched. And I wonder, was it just that one time? Or is it still out there, watching, waiting, in the shadows of Mount Zenith? I don't know. And honestly, I don't think I ever want to know for sure. Story 10. We'd been out there for maybe 3 hours. The cold was really getting to me. Even moving around every now and then didn't help much. Davies and I were mostly quiet. Not much to talk about at that hour anyway. Just the usual mumbled complaints about the cold, about the exercises, about army food. The woods were quiet too. Spooky quiet, if you want to know the truth. The kind of quiet where you feel like you're the only living thing for miles, and everything around you is just watching. You get that feeling in the woods at night sometimes, like you're being observed. I shrugged it off. Told myself it was just the darkness and the cold playing tricks on my mind. Then it happened. Out of nowhere. No warning, no rustle in the leaves beforehand. Nothing. Just silence 1 second, and then this sound. Not loud, but distinct. Like a heavy branch snapping but wrong. Too deep, too organic. It came from somewhere to our right, towards the riverbank, maybe 20, 30 yards away. Davies and I both froze. Every instinct I had went on high alert. We'd been told about wild animals, sure. Maybe a bear or a cougar could wander through. But this didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. I grabbed my rifle tighter, thumbed off the safety without even thinking. Davies did the same. We were both staring into the blackness, trying to see past the trees, past the shadows, past the goddamn darkness that felt like it was pressing down on you. The river was making a lot of noise, rushing water sounds echoing, which made it harder to pinpoint anything. For a few seconds, nothing. Just the river, the wind, our breathing. I held my breath, strained my ears. Nothing. Maybe it was just a branch after all. Maybe I was just too jumpy. Then Davies hissed, "Murph, what the hell is that?" His voice was low, strained, tight with something that was definitely more than just surprise. It was fear, raw, gut-wrenching fear. And when I followed his gaze, when I saw what he was looking at, my blood turned to ice. There, maybe 20 yards away, just on the edge of the tree line, where the moonlight broke through the branches and spilled onto a small clearing, it was standing. Or rising. It was huge, I mean truly monstrously huge, taller than any man I'd ever seen, easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and wide, like a brick wall wide. It was humanoid vaguely, but distorted, wrong. The moonlight was weak, patchy, but it was enough to make out the shape. It was all muscle, just layers and layers of bulging dark muscle, packed onto a frame that looked like it shouldn't be able to hold itself upright. Its shoulders were massive, hunched slightly forward, giving it this looming, powerful presence. It was dark, too. Not just shadowed by the night, but dark in itself, like it absorbed the light. Its skin, if it was skin, looked thick, almost leathery, a deep muddy brown color. It was moving slowly, deliberately towards the river. Not walking exactly, more like lumbering, each step heavy, deliberate, and it was making a sound. A low, guttural growl deep in its chest that vibrated in the air, even over the sound of the river. Not aggressive, not like a bear growling a warning. This was something else, something ancient and primal, like the sound the earth might make if it could groan. And the smell, Jesus Christ, the smell. It hit me then, after the sight of it, a thick, cloying, musky odor that made my stomach churn, like a wet dog that's been rotting for days. But stronger, more intense, it clung to the air, thick and suffocating. I wanted to gag, to vomit, but I was frozen solid, my breath caught in my throat. My mind went blank, completely, utterly blank. Training, drills, orders, everything just vanished. There was only this thing, this massive hulking figure moving towards us in the dark, making those ungodly noises and stinking like death. I couldn't think, couldn't move, couldn't even speak. I just stood there, rifle raised, finger frozen on the trigger, staring at it in stunned horror. Davies let out another strangled whisper. What? What is that, Murph? I couldn't answer. I didn't know, didn't have a single clue what I was looking at. Some kind of animal. But no animal should be that big, that monstrous. And that smell, that sound. It wasn't animal. It was other. The creature kept moving slowly, relentlessly towards the riverbank. It didn't look at us, didn't acknowledge us at all. It was like we weren't even there, which, in a way, made it even worse. Like we were insignificant beneath its notice. That thing could have snapped us in half without even breaking stride. I knew it. It reached the riverbank, and then it stopped. Just stood there, at the edge of the water, its huge silhouette outlined against the pale moonlight, reflecting off the river surface. It was like it was considering the river, or maybe listening to it, or something else entirely. We stood there, Davies and me, frozen in place for what felt like an eternity. Minutes, maybe, I don't know. Time seemed to warp, to stretch and distort. Every second felt like an hour. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, feel the sweat trickling down my back despite the freezing cold. My hands were clammy on my rifle, shaking almost uncontrollably, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. It didn't run, didn't sprint, didn't even seem to move that fast. It just melted back into the shadows. 1 second it was there, a towering monstrosity in the moonlight, and the next second it was gone. Vanished, like it had never been there at all. Except the smell. That god-awful stench still hung in the air, thick and nauseating. A lingering reminder of what we'd just seen. We stood there, paralyzed, for a long time after it disappeared. I don't know how long. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. Everything was silent again except for the river, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This silence was heavy, charged, pregnant with something unspoken, something terrifying. Finally, Davies moved. He took a shaky step back, then another. He turned to me, his face pale and streaked with sweat, even in the moonlight. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, filled with a terror that mirrored my own. Did you see that? He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. You saw that, right? I'm not crazy. I managed to nod, to croak out a single word. Yeah. That was all I could manage. Just, yeah. What else could I say? What the hell was that thing? I had no words, no explanations. Only the raw, primal fear that still gripped me. We didn't speak much after that. We just stood there, back to back, scanning the darkness, every nerve in our bodies screaming. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like something huge was approaching. We were both convinced it was going to come back, that it was still out there, watching us, waiting. The rest of the night was a blur. Every minute felt like an hour. We jumped at every sound, every shadow. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first hint of light started to creep through the trees, I felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made me weak. As soon as we were relieved from duty, we practically ran back to camp. We were both still shaken to the core, our nerves frayed, our minds racing. We needed to tell someone. We needed to make sense of what we'd seen. We found Sergeant Miller at the mess tent getting coffee. He was a gruff guy, old school, seen it all, or so we thought. We rushed up to him, practically tripping over ourselves, and started babbling about what we'd seen, about the huge creature, the smell, the sounds, everything. Miller listened, but his expression didn't change. He took a sip of his coffee, then another. He just looked at us, those cold, hard eyes of his, and when we finally finished our breathless, disjointed account, he let out a short, sharp laugh. "Bigfoot hunters, huh?" he said, a sneer curling his lip. "That's what you two are now, out in the woods for a couple of hours, and you think you saw Bigfoot?" Davies tried to argue, to explain again, to convey the sheer terror of the encounter. But Miller just cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Look," he said, his voice dismissive, "you were tired, cold, probably hallucinating. It was probably just a bear, or a deer in the shadows, or nothing at all. You guys spooked yourselves. Happens all the time. Now get yourselves some breakfast and stop wasting my time with fairy tales." And that was it. Dismissed. Laughing stock. Bigfoot hunters. He told a couple of other guys too, and soon the whole platoon knew. We got laughed at for days. Guys would make ape noises when we walked by, draw hairy monsters on our lockers. Davies and I just shut up. We stopped talking about it to anyone. What was the point? No one believed us. They just thought we were idiots. The incident got buried, as they say in the army. Officially, nothing happened. Just another routine night on field exercises. Unofficially, Davies and I knew what we'd seen. We knew it wasn't a bear, wasn't a deer, wasn't a hallucination. It was something real, something terrifying, something unnatural. Davies left the army a few months later, said he couldn't take it anymore. I don't know if it was because of what happened that night or just coincidence, but he was never the same afterwards. Quiet, jumpy, always looking over his shoulder. I lost touch with him after a while. Me? I stayed in, did my time, got out, but I never forgot. Never could forget. That night, that thing, it's still there in the back of my mind. A cold knot of fear that tightens whenever I think about it. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I can almost smell that smell again. That sickening, rotting musk. And I remember the growl, the size of it, the sheer wrongness of it. I've tried to rationalize it, to find some explanation, something normal, but there isn't one. Not for what we saw, and part of me knows, deep down, that we weren't meant to see it, that some things are best left hidden, lurking in the darkness, beyond the edge of our understanding. I never went back to Fort Jasper after I got out, never wanted to. That patch of woods by the Nali River is still out there, and sometimes I wonder, is it still out there too? Watching, waiting, and what else is out there, hidden in the shadows, that we don't know about, that we can't even imagine? I don't have any answers, just this story, this memory, this fear that I can't shake, even after all these years, and the certainty deep down that whatever we saw that night, it was real, and it was something truly horrific, something that should never have been seen. Key Story 11. Okay, so this is going to sound crazy, I know, but I swear on everything, it's the truth. I'm still messed up about it, to be honest. Haven't really talked about it much, except with Craig, my brother, because he was there too, saw the whole damn thing. Figured maybe putting it out there, even anonymously, would help. I don't know, something. It was supposed to be a chill weekend. You know, get away from the city, the usual grind. We'd booked a cabin up in Fernwood State Forest, Hidden Creek Campground. Cute little place, nestled right in the woods. Me, my wife Sarah, our son Benjamin, who's 6, and Craig and his wife Lisa. We've done camping trips before, nothing fancy, just to get the kids outdoors and breathe some real air. Friday night was great. Cooked burgers, roasted marshmallows around the fire, the whole shebang. Benjamin was in heaven, running around with his little headlamp, exploring. He's got this stuffed monkey, Ducky, that goes everywhere with him. Seriously, everywhere. Sleeps with it, eats with it. Ducky's practically part of the family. Saturday afternoon, that's when it started going sideways. We decided to take a little hike. Nothing strenuous, just one of the marked trails around the campsite, meant to be easy for families with kids. Benjamin was skipping ahead, Ducky clutched in his hand. We were maybe half an hour in, just enjoying the woods, the sun filtering through the trees, you know, peaceful. And then Benjamin starts freaking out, like full-on meltdown. At first, we couldn't figure out what was wrong. He was just sobbing, pointing back down the trail. Sarah thought he'd tripped and hurt himself, but he kept saying, "Ducky's gone, Ducky's lost." Turns out, somewhere along the way, Ducky had fallen out of his grasp, and neither of us had noticed. And for Benjamin, it was the end of the world. I mean, seriously, this monkey is his life. We tried to calm him down, told him we'd go back and look for it. It was getting late afternoon, but still plenty of daylight. Figured it couldn't be too far back, and we didn't want Benjamin to be miserable all weekend. Plus, honestly, Ducky was more than just a toy. It was important. So Craig and I grabbed our flashlights from the cabin. Sarah and Lisa stayed back with Benjamin, trying to distract him and saying we'd be back soon with his buddy. The sun was already dipping below the trees when Craig and I headed back down the trail. It was getting shadowy fast. The woods get darker quicker than you think, especially when the trees are thick. We were calling out, "Ducky, here, Ducky," like idiots, but we figured we had to try something. Honestly, I was a bit annoyed. I mean, it was just a stuffed animal, right? But seeing Benjamin's face, you know you gotta do what you gotta do. We walked back the way we came, scanning the sides of the trail with our flashlights. It was getting quieter too. The birds had stopped singing, and that daytime forest noise kind of just faded away. Just the crunch of our boots on the leaves and our breathing, and then we started hearing it. At first it was faint, a rhythmic thumping sound, like someone hitting wood with something. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from somewhere off to our left, deeper in the trees. We stopped walking and listened. Thump, thump, thump. It was regular, like a heartbeat, but slower and deeper. And it was loud, even though it sounded distant. The air felt different, heavier, colder. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, not just on your skin. "What's that?" I whispered to Craig. He's always been the more outdoorsy one, grew up hunting and fishing with our dad. He knows the woods way better than I do. He frowned, tilting his head, listening hard. "Don't know," he mumbled. "Sounds like someone chopping wood." But it wasn't a chopping sound. It was too even, too regular. And who would be chopping wood in the middle of the woods this late in the day? And why would it sound so heavy? We started walking again, slowly. The thumping was still there, but now it seemed to move. Thump, thump, thump. Now it was coming from our right, further down the trail, closer to the edge of the woods. Then back to the left again. It was like it was circling us, but keeping its distance. Thump, thump, thump. It was definitely following us. Craig stopped dead in his tracks. He put his hand on my arm, his grip tight. His eyes were wide, and he was staring into the trees on our left, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He whispered, and his voice was hoarse, "Something's out there, Josh." I swallowed hard. My heart started to pound in my chest. I could feel the adrenaline kick in. "What? What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out shaky. He didn't answer right away. He just kept staring into the trees, slowly panning his flashlight beam back and forth. The thumping stopped. Everything was dead quiet, except for our breathing. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Craig said the word that made my blood run cold. "Bigfoot," I laughed, a nervous, shaky laugh. "Bigfoot? Come on, Craig, seriously? Bigfoot? You're kidding, right?" He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on something in the darkness beyond the edge of my flashlight beam. "I'm not kidding, Josh. I'm dead serious. I think we're being watched." I'm not gonna lie. At that moment, I felt a prickle of fear run down my spine. Bigfoot. I mean, I'd heard the stories, seen documentaries, always thought it was just a bunch of nonsense, folk tales. But seeing Craig like this, so serious, so genuinely scared, it was unsettling. Craig isn't someone who gets spooked easily. I shone my flashlight into the woods where he was looking. Nothing, just trees and shadows. "I don't see anything," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Probably just an animal. A deer, maybe, or I don't know. A bear." "Doesn't sound like a bear," Craig muttered, still scanning the trees. "And it's too deliberate, too rhythmic. He paused again, and then he pointed his flashlight a little further into the woods, deeper than before. "Look," he whispered, "over there." And that's when I saw it. Just for a second. A dark shape, maybe 20-30 yards into the trees. It was just a glimpse, a fleeting impression in the shadows, but it was big, massive, taller than any tree trunk around it, and it was hairy, or furry. It was hard to tell in the dark, but it was definitely not just shadows and trees. My breath caught in my throat. I pointed my own flashlight towards the same spot, but whatever it was gone. Just darkness again, except for a pair of eyes. Reflected in the light, 2 points of light glowed back at us, high up, way above the ground. And they weren't the eyes of a deer or a raccoon. They were too big, and they had this weird red glow, like embers in the dark. We stood there, frozen, staring at those eyes, and those eyes were staring back at us, for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. And then, slowly, impossibly slowly, a shape started to emerge from the shadows behind those eyes. It was huge, taller than I could have imagined. Even in the dim light I could see it. A massive, dark shape, solid, real, covered in thick, dark fur. And it was upright, standing on 2 legs, just like the stories. It was like a tree had come to life, but not a normal tree. An ancient, twisted, monstrous tree walking out of the woods. It was wider than a tree too, bulky, muscled, and it moved silently. Even though it was huge, it moved without a sound, except for its breathing. We could hear its breathing, deep, ragged breaths like a bellows, like something huge and powerful drawing air into its lungs, and its smell. God, the smell. It hit me then, thick and heavy in the air, musky, rank, like wet dog and something else, something rotten, animalistic. It was overpowering, nauseating, fear, pure, unadulterated, primal fear. That's what I felt. It wasn't just being scared. It was something deeper, something ancient. Like my body remembered this fear from a time long before people lived in houses and drove cars. A fear of the dark, of the wild, of things that hunt in the shadows. Craig grabbed my arm again, tighter this time. "Run!" he hissed, his voice cracking. "Run, Josh! Run!" And we did. We turned and ran. We didn't even think about Ducky anymore. We just ran. Back down the trail as fast as we could, our flashlights bouncing wildly in front of us. The branches whipped at our faces. We stumbled over roots and rocks, but we didn't stop. We didn't dare to look back. We could hear it behind us, not running, not crashing through the woods, but following. That same rhythmic thumping sound, but closer now, louder. Thump, thump, thump. And the breathing, the heavy, ragged breaths, closer too, right behind us. And the smell, that awful animalistic smell, filling our nostrils, choking us. We ran and ran, our lungs burning, our hearts pounding in our chests like drums. We could see the lights of the campsite up ahead, through the trees. The cabin, thank God, the cabin was getting closer. We burst out of the woods and into the clearing around the cabin, gasping for air, stumbling onto the porch. Sarah and Lisa were there, Benjamin in Sarah's arms, still sniffling. They stared at us, their faces filled with worry. "What happened?" Sarah cried. "What's wrong?" We couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. We just pointed back at the woods, our chests heaving. Craig managed to gasp out, "Bigfoot! Woods! It's following!" Sarah and Lisa exchanged a look, disbelief mixed with alarm. They saw our faces, our terror, and they knew something was seriously wrong. Benjamin started crying again, scared by our fear. We dragged them inside the cabin, locked the door, bolted it shut. We slammed the curtains closed on every window. We huddled together in the living room, still shaking, still listening. The sounds followed us. We could hear them outside the cabin. The wood knocks, closer now, right at the edge of the clearing. Thump, thump, thump. And the breathing, right outside the walls, heavy, rasping, like it was right there, pressed up against the wood. The smell was still there too, faint but lingering, seeping under the door cracks. Sarah and Lisa were scared now. I could see it in their eyes. They'd seen our faces. They heard our voices. They knew we weren't joking. We told them what we'd seen, what we'd heard, in hushed, panicked whispers. They still looked skeptical, but the fear was real in the air. We stayed up all night. We kept the lights off, just huddled together by the fireplace, staring at the walls, listening. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside the window made us jump. The wood knocks continued on and off through the night, sometimes distant, sometimes right outside the cabin walls. Thump, thump, thump. It felt like it was testing us, circling us, watching us. And then, just before dawn, when the first hint of light was starting to creep through the cracks in the curtains, we heard it. The sound that I will never ever forget as long as I live. It started as a low growl deep in the woods, a guttural rumbling that vibrated through the cabin. And then it rose and rose and rose into a howl. But not like any howl I'd ever heard from any animal. It was deafening, ear-splitting. It was like the sound of pure terror made audible. A shriek of rage and something else. Something ancient and sorrowful and utterly alien. It went on and on, echoing through the woods, shaking the trees, rattling the windows of the cabin. It was inhuman, unearthly. It clawed at your soul. It was the sound of something monstrous and heartbroken and impossibly, terrifyingly real. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. Except for our ragged breathing and Benjamin whimpering in Sarah's arms. The woods were silent, the air was still, the dawn was breaking. We didn't sleep. We stayed locked in the cabin until it was fully light. Then we packed up our stuff as fast as we could. We didn't even eat breakfast. We loaded everything into the cars, got Benjamin buckled in, and we drove out of Hidden Creek Campground. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back on the highway, heading towards the city. We haven't been back to Fernwood State Forest since. We haven't talked about it much. Sarah and Lisa, they still look at us sometimes with that mixture of concern and disbelief in their eyes. They saw how scared we were, but I don't know if they truly believe what we saw. But Craig and I, we know what we saw in those woods that night. We know what we heard, and we know we'll never forget it. Ducky's still lost, by the way. Benjamin still asks about him sometimes. But I'm not going back into those woods. Not ever. Not even for Ducky. Story 12. So, I figured I should at least check it out. See what was what. The lawyer said it was mine now, free and clear, but someone needed to go up there and get it ready to either sell or... I don't even know what. Rent it out to squatters? Seriously, it was that bad. But I had this weird feeling about it too. Like maybe there was something there worth saving. Maybe it was just nostalgia from the stories. I don't know. Anyway, I drove up on a Friday afternoon, figuring I'd spend the weekend, try to at least make a dent in the overgrown mess that was supposed to be a yard. The drive itself was creepy. You get off the main highway, and then it's just these winding back roads, deeper and deeper into woods. No cell service after a point, just trees, fields, and this heavy silence. By the time I got to the property, it was already late afternoon. The house. Man, it was worse than I imagined. Paint peeling off in sheets, porch sagging, windows grimy. The yard was completely swallowed by weeds and bushes. It looked like something out of a horror movie, honestly. I got the key from the lockbox, shoved it in the door, and it creaked open like it hadn't been opened in decades. Dust hit me like a wall. Inside was dark and smelled stale, musty. Furniture covered in sheets, cobwebs everywhere, that thick, dead air you get in old, abandoned places. It was depressing, you know. This was supposed to be where my mom spent summers, happy memories and all that, and now it just felt empty and kind of sad. I spent the rest of the day just trying to clear a path, both inside and outside, just to make it livable enough to stay the night. Uncovered a dusty old couch, swept a little, got some air moving by opening windows, even though they were all sticky and hard to budge. Went outside and started hacking at the weeds around the house, just enough to get to the porch and the front door without wading through waist-high crap. The whole time I had this feeling, this prickling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. It was broad daylight, but the woods around the property were so thick, so dense, it was always kind of shadowy and silent. Too silent, maybe. Just the buzzing of insects and the occasional bird, but it felt watched. I kept looking around, expecting to see a deer or something, but nothing. Just trees, bushes, that heavy, silent green. I shrugged it off at first, thinking I was just being jumpy because of the place, being alone in the middle of nowhere. By the time it got dark, I was exhausted, covered in dirt and sweat. I made myself a sandwich with the stuff I brought, drank a beer on the porch looking out at the yard. It was getting properly dark now, and the woods just seemed to swallow up the light. Everything turned shades of black and grey, and the air got colder, even though it was May. Then I heard it. It started off faint, like it was far away, carried on the wind. A howl, not like a dog howl. Deeper, longer, almost musical. It was weird. My first thought was coyotes. We get them back home sometimes. Their yipping and howling is pretty common. But this was different. This was lower, more resonant. It echoed through the trees in a way coyote howls never do. I listened, and it came again. The same long, drawn-out sound. Probably just owls, I muttered to myself. That sounded reasonable, right? Big owls, maybe? I tried to convince myself of that. But even as I said it, I knew it didn't quite fit. It wasn't the hoot of an owl, it was more like a mournful cry, or a call. The howls kept going throughout the night. Not constantly, but every so often, maybe every hour or so, drifting through the woods. Each time I'd wake up a little, listen for a minute, then try to go back to sleep, telling myself it was just some animal out in the woods, doing its thing. But it messed with my sleep. I tossed and turned, never really getting comfortable, that strange sound hanging in the back of my mind. It wasn't just the sound itself, it was the feeling it gave me, unease, like something wasn't right. Morning came, finally. Grey, overcast, the kind of morning that looks like it's about to rain even though the forecast said sunny. I made some instant coffee in a travel mug, took it out to the porch. I figured some fresh air, even damp air, would clear my head. The howls had stopped sometime before dawn, or at least I hadn't heard them since I properly woke up. I sat on the porch steps, sipping my coffee, looking out at the foggy yard. The fog was thick, clinging to the ground, swirling around the overgrown bushes. It made everything look blurry, distorted, kind of creepy, actually. Then I heard the rustling. It came from the bushes just to the side of the porch near the corner of the house. Just a little crackling, like something moving through the leaves and branches. Squirrel, maybe? Raccoon? Could be anything. I took another sip of coffee, watching the bushes, waiting to see what popped out. Then it howled again. Just like the night before, that deep, long sound. But this time it was closer. Much closer. It felt like it was right at the edge of the woods, just beyond the yard. The sound vibrated in the air, in my chest. It wasn't something you just heard. You felt it. Before I could even properly react to that, before I could even place my coffee mug down, there was another howl. And this one was different, louder, explosive. It came from the other side of the house, just feet away. It was so close it made my ears ring. It felt like it ripped through the fog, through the air, right into me. My blood went cold, like instant ice water in my veins. Every hair on my body stood up. I froze, just completely paralyzed. My heart was hammering in my chest, so loud I could hear it over the ringing in my ears. I didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move. My eyes were fixed on the corner of the house where the sound had come from, where the bushes met the fog. And then it emerged. From the swirling fog, from behind the bushes, this thing. It was big. God, it was huge. Taller than me, easily. Maybe 7, 8 feet tall. And it was covered in hair. Dark hair. Thick, matted-looking hair. It moved slowly, deliberately, stepping out of the fog like it was in no hurry at all. I couldn't see its face clearly. The fog was still thick around it, especially at ground level, but I could make out a shape, a head, on top of this massive body. And eyes. Dark eyes, reflecting the little bit of morning light filtering through the clouds. Indistinct, yeah, but I saw them. And they were looking at me, staring right at me. It wasn't like an animal looking at you. This was different. It was like it was assessing me, evaluating. I don't know how to explain it, but there was something intelligent in those eyes, something considering. Terror, pure ice-cold terror gripped me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even scream. My lungs felt like they were clamped shut. I just stared, locked onto this creature, this thing that shouldn't exist, standing just yards away from me in the morning fog. And then the sound started. Not from the creature itself, not at first, but from the fog all around it, all around me. Whispers, faint, sibilant whispers, like voices, but distorted, muffled, like they were coming from far away, but also right next to my ear. And hissing sounds, too, like snakes or something breathing heavily through clenched teeth. The whispers and hisses swirled around in the fog, surrounding the creature, surrounding me. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They weren't words, not that I could understand, just sounds. Unintelligible, unsettling sounds. They sent shivers down my spine, colder than the morning air, colder than the fear already freezing me to the bone. The creature, it just stood there, watching me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound itself, it just was. A dark, hulking mass in the fog, surrounded by these eerie whispers and hisses, its dark eyes fixed on mine. It felt like forever, like time just stopped, like nothing else existed in the world but me and this thing. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned. It turned its massive body away from me, back towards the woods. It didn't run, it didn't bolt, it just stepped back into the fog. One heavy step, then another, and another, until it was gone, swallowed by the swirling mist as if it had never been there at all. The whispers and hisses faded too, slowly dying away as the fog shifted and moved. Silence returned. Heavy, absolute silence. Just the faint sound of birds starting to chirp in the distance, like nothing had happened. I stood there on the porch, frozen solid for I don't know how long. Minutes, hours. Time had no meaning anymore. My coffee was still in my hand, stone cold now. My legs were stiff, my muscles cramped. But I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My mind was just blank, empty, except for the image of that creature, burned into my brain. Eventually, slowly, the paralysis started to wear off. My fingers started to twitch, then my toes. I could feel my heartbeat again, slowly calming down from the frantic hammering. I put the coffee mug down, carefully, like it was made of glass, and might shatter if I breathed too hard. I backed away from the porch, slowly, step by step, keeping my eyes fixed on the woods, on the fog, ready to run, to scream, to do something. But there was nothing there, just fog, trees, silence. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, even though I knew, deep down, locks wouldn't matter against something like that. I just needed to feel like I was doing something. I packed my bag as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip the zipper. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, everything I needed, and I walked out of that house, leaving everything else behind. I didn't care about cleaning up the property or selling it or any of it. I just wanted to get out, get away, and never ever go back. I drove away from Tippecanoe that morning like my hair was on fire. Didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main highway, back in civilization, where there were other cars, other people, noise, and normalcy, or something like it. When I told my wife what happened, she didn't believe me exactly. She thinks I was stressed, tired, maybe imagined it. Probably a bear, she said, or a really big dog. Fog plays tricks on your eyes. Bears don't howl like that. Dogs don't stand on two legs and have those eyes, and neither makes those whispering, hissing sounds in the fog. I tried to explain, but how do you explain something like that? Something that defies all logic, all reason? You can't. You just sound crazy. The lawyer called me a week later, asking about the property, about getting it ready to sell. I told him to hire someone to clean it up, pay whatever it costs, just get it done. I told him I wasn't going back. Ever. He sounded confused, said something about me inheriting it, about family, about money. I just cut him off. Just get it done, I said, and don't ask me to go back there, please. He didn't push it. Maybe he heard something in my voice. Maybe he just figured I was being difficult. I don't know, and I don't care. I haven't been back to Tippecanoe since. I don't want to go back. Ever. The thought of that place, that fog, those woods, it still makes my stomach clench. I still hear those howls in my head sometimes, late at night when everything's quiet, and those whispers. They still haunt me. I don't know what it was I saw that morning. I don't know what those sounds were. I don't know why it was there, or what it wanted. I just know it was real, it happened, and it changed something in me. I look at woods differently now, fog differently, silence differently. The world, it just doesn't feel quite as safe anymore. Knowing that something like that, something unexplained, exists out there in the dark corners of the world, it just stays with you. And I can't shake it off no matter how hard I try, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. It's like a part of that fog, of those woods, of that fear, just came back with me, and it's still here, right now, as I write this, and I don't know what to do about it. I just don't know. Story 13. It was back in '67. I was just a kid, maybe 10, and my grandpa, he was this old-school woodsman type, grizzled, quiet, knew the bush like the back of his hand. Every year, without fail, we'd head up north for deer season. Usually it was just him and me. We had this old hunting cabin way out past Groundhog River, deep in the Ontario wilderness. It was rough, nothing fancy, just logs, a tin roof, a wood stove, bunk beds. You get the picture. Primitive, but it was ours. It was our place. We spent so many good times there. This year, that year, felt different right from the get-go. The drive up seemed longer, the air felt heavy, even for October. I remember being restless in the truck, asking a million questions, you know, kid stuff. Grandpa was quieter than usual, just grunting answers now and then, staring straight ahead at the road. I didn't think much of it at the time. Grandpa wasn't a big talker anyway. We finally got to the turnoff for the cabin trail, this barely there dirt track that snaked through the trees. Even that seemed overgrown, like it hadn't been used in years, which was ridiculous because we were just there last season. But that was the feeling. Everything felt off. Then we reached the clearing where the cabin was supposed to be, and that's when I saw it, or rather what was left of it. It wasn't like a storm had hit. It wasn't like a tree had fallen on it. It was just wrecked, violently, intentionally wrecked. My first thought was bears. Bears can be destructive, sure, but this wasn't that. This was methodical chaos. The cabin door was gone, not just off the hinges, but ripped clean out of the frame, wood splintered and hanging every which way. It was like someone had taken a can opener to a tin of sardines, but on a cabin door. We got out of the truck, and I remember the silence hitting me. The woods are never truly silent, you know. There's always birds chirping, the wind rustling through leaves, something. But here, it was dead quiet. Unnerving quiet. Grandpa just stopped, truck door hanging open, staring at the cabin. He didn't say a word, and that was the first real jolt of fear I felt. Grandpa always had an answer for everything, knew how to handle everything in the bush. Seeing him speechless, just frozen, that was way more terrifying than the cabin itself, in a way. We cautiously started walking towards it. That's when I saw the stove, our old cast-iron wood stove. It wasn't inside the cabin anymore. It was outside, like way outside. It was lying on its side, at least 100 yards from the cabin near the edge of the woods, just dragged there. That stove was heavy. Grandpa and I together struggled to even nudge it into place inside every year when we opened up the cabin. And here it was, thrown out like a broken toy. As we got closer to the cabin itself, the smell hit us. It was this acrid, musty animal smell, but not like any animal I knew. Not like bear, not like deer, not even like a skunk. It was raw and old, like something primal. We stepped inside the cabin, or what was left of inside. It was like a tornado had gone through it, but a tornado that was selective somehow. The bunk beds were gone, vanished, not broken, not splintered, just not there, like they'd been lifted right out and taken away. The mattresses were gone too. Everything related to sleeping was gone. Our food containers, the big metal ones we used to keep flour, sugar, dried beans, everything was scattered all over the floor, ripped open like paper, and everything was rifled through, like someone or something had been searching. But not just casually searching, intensely, angrily searching. The metal grates for the stove, the heavy steel ones, they were twisted, not bent, twisted, like someone had grabbed them and just wrung them like wet towels. Steel, twisted. My child's brain couldn't even comprehend that kind of strength. Grandpa finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly, like he was forcing the words out. What in God's name? He stepped further into the cabin and I followed, glued to his side. We checked everything. Every cupboard was flung open, drawers pulled out and dumped. Even things that weren't of any value, things that would just be clutter, were thrown around, broken. An old chipped enamel plate was shattered on the floor. A rusty tin cup was bent double. It was spiteful. It felt like whatever did this was angry. Grandpa started to move around, slowly, cautiously, examining everything. He ran a hand over the splintered doorframe, then crouched down, looking at the ground. He was tracking. Even I knew that much. He was looking for prints, signs. He followed something out from the cabin, around to the back, and disappeared for a few minutes behind a thick patch of trees. I stood by the ruined cabin door, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The silence was still there, pressing down, suffocating. The smell was getting stronger, making my stomach churn. Grandpa came back, his face even more grim than before. He just shook his head. Nothing, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Clean. Too clean. What did it, Grandpa? I asked, my voice trembling. Was it a bear? He looked at me, and I could see fear in his eyes. Not the normal kind of fear, like being afraid of the dark or a loud noise. This was primal fear, fear that went way down deep. No, son, he said finally, wasn't a bear. Then what? I pressed. What could do this? He just shook his head again, his eyes darting around the clearing, like he was expecting something to jump out of the woods. He didn't answer me directly. He just said, "We're leaving. Right now. We're not staying here." And that was it. No arguments, no questions, no trying to figure it out. Grandpa, the man who knew everything about the woods, was spooked, terrified even. And that was enough for me. If Grandpa was scared, then I was terrified. We didn't even unpack the truck. We just got back in. Grandpa started the engine, and we drove away, fast. Looking back, I remember him watching the rearview mirror, checking as we drove down that trail, like he expected something to be following us. We didn't talk much on the drive back home. The silence in the truck was different now. It was heavy, weighted with something unspoken, something terrifying that had just happened. I wanted to ask him again what it was. What could have done that to the cabin, but I was too scared. Scared of the answer, maybe, or scared that he still wouldn't have one. We never went back to that cabin. That was the end of our hunting trips to Groundhog River. Grandpa never spoke about it again. Not really. If I ever brought it up, he'd just get quiet. His eyes would go distant, and he'd change the subject. It was like the whole thing was just erased, like it never happened. But I knew it did. I saw it. I smelled it. I felt it. That cold, raw fear. For years, that memory just sat there in the back of my mind, a puzzle with no pieces. I tried to rationalize it. Storm damage, vandals, some kind of weird animal. None of it fit. Nothing explained the stove being dragged, the steel grates twisted, the beds vanishing, the methodical destruction. It was all too calculated, too powerful, too something else. Then, years later, I was watching some late-night TV, just channel surfing, and stumbled across this show about Bigfoot. I know, sounds crazy, right? But hear me out. They were talking about encounters, sightings, strange tracks, and they started describing the kinds of things that are sometimes associated with these creatures. Strength beyond belief, an almost playful destructiveness sometimes, mixed with something else, something darker. Territoriality, anger, intelligence. And as I listened to them talk, it started to click. Little pieces of that old memory started falling into place. The ripped door, the stove, the twisted metal, the rifled containers, the sheer brute force. And that smell, that raw, animal, primal smell. They describe that too sometimes. Suddenly, the unexplainable became slightly less unexplainable. Not that I suddenly understood everything. Not that I suddenly became a Bigfoot believer overnight, because it's still wild to even say the word. But it was like a different lens had been placed in front of my eyes. A terrifying lens, but a lens nonetheless. Could it have been? Could what we saw, what we experienced, have been that? Something like Bigfoot? Some huge, powerful, intelligent creature that for whatever reason decided to tear our cabin apart? I don't know. I still don't know for sure. And honestly, part of me doesn't want to know. The mystery is terrifying, yes, but there's a certain comfort in the unknown too. Because the alternative is acknowledging that something like that exists, something that powerful, that unseen, that other, roaming around out there in the woods, maybe closer than we think. I still go into the woods sometimes for hikes, for walks, but it's different now. I don't feel the same peace I used to. There's always this little seed of unease, this prickle on my skin. Every shadow seems a little darker. Every rustle in the leaves sounds a little louder, and I can't help but think about that cabin, about the silence, about the smell, and about Grandpa's face that day. The face of a man who had seen something he couldn't explain, something that scared him to his core. And that fear is what sticks with me most. It just happened. We went to the cabin, it was destroyed, we left. And we never talked about it again. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever did that is still out there, somewhere, watching, unseen. And that thought, that's what really chills me. Because if it could do that to a cabin, what else is it capable of? And what if one day it decides it doesn't just want to wreck cabins anymore? What then? That's it. That's my story. I know it sounds crazy. I know people will probably roll their eyes, say it was a bear, say I imagined it, whatever. But I was there, I saw it, and I felt the fear. And that's real enough for me. It's real enough to stay with me, always. Story 14. The first couple of days were exactly that. Sunny, warm days. We hiked, fished in the small creek nearby, told stories around the fire at night. It was peaceful, like really deeply peaceful. The kind of quiet you only get when you're miles from anywhere, with no cell service, just the rustle of leaves and the crackle of the fire. Even the nights were quiet, just crickets and the occasional owl hooting way off in the distance. My dog, Blue, a big old blue Gila mix, was in heaven. He loves being outside, sniffing around, chasing squirrels during the day, and sleeping at the foot of my sleeping bag at night. Blue's a tough dog. I've seen him stand his ground against a badger that wandered too close to our old hunting cabin once, and he's faced down coyotes without even a flinch. He's fearless when it comes to normal animal stuff. On the third night, everything changed. We'd had dinner, burgers grilled over the open fire, and we were sitting around, the fire dying down, just embers glowing orange in the dark. Sarah and my sister were talking about constellations, trying to pick out the Big Dipper and Orion in the sky, which was unbelievably clear up there, filled with more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. My dad and I were mostly listening, half watching the flames, half listening to their chatter. Blue was lying at my feet, head resting on my boots, dozing like he always did when things were calm. It must have been around 10, maybe 11 at night. The forest was quiet in that normal way, the kind of quiet you get used to out there, a low hum of insects and the wind sighing through the pines. Then it stopped. Not just quiet, but silent. Like everything in the woods, just held its breath. The crickets went silent, the wind died down, even the fire seemed to burn quieter, if that's even possible. It wasn't just silence, it was an absence of sound, like the world muted itself. I remember thinking it was strange, but I didn't think too much of it. Maybe an owl had just swooped down, or something spooked the night creatures for a second. Then it happened. It started low, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I felt it more than heard it at first, a tremor in my chest, like something massive was shifting deep in the woods. At first I thought maybe it was thunder, way off in the distance, but the sky was clear, star-studded, not a cloud in sight. And it wasn't the right kind of rumble for thunder. This was deeper, heavier, more organic. Then the sound rose. It built from that low rumble into something else, something I've never heard before or since. It was a howl, but unlike any animal howl I know. And I know coyote howls, wolf howls, even the eerie yipping of foxes. I've spent countless nights in the woods listening to all of them. This wasn't any of that. Imagine a howl, but magnified, amplified to an impossible volume. Imagine something huge, with lungs the size of barrels, letting out a cry that ripped through the night. It wasn't just loud, it was powerful. It resonated, it vibrated the air, it seemed to shake the very trees around us. And it went on, and on, and on. It wasn't a quick bark or yelp. This was drawn out, sustained, echoing through the forest for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only, I don't know, 10, 15 seconds, maybe longer. Time felt different then, distorted, and the sound itself, it's hard to describe. It was primate somehow, but not like a monkey or a chimp you'd hear at the zoo. This was deeper, more guttural, more feral. It had a weight to it, a resonance that was almost human, in a twisted, wrong kind of way, but colossal, absolutely colossal. Like if a gorilla was the size of a bear and it screamed from the depths of its soul. That's the closest I can get. It wasn't just scary loud, it was terrifying. A primal, bone-deep kind of terror, the kind of fear that bypasses your brain and goes straight to your gut. Every hair on my body stood on end. My heart started hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break free. My breath hitched in my throat, and Blue, who faced down badgers, who chased off coyotes. Blue reacted like I've never seen him react to anything. He bolted, not barking, not growling, not facing the sound like he usually would. He just ran straight for me, tail tucked so tight between his legs I thought it would disappear, whimpering, a low, choked whine that was heartbreaking to hear coming from him. He scrambled under my chair, practically crawling on his belly, and wedged himself as far under as he could get, trembling violently. This wasn't his normal scared of thunder trembling. This was pure, abject terror. The howl finally stopped, just cut off. As suddenly as it started, it was gone. And the silence that followed, that was somehow worse. The normal forest sounds didn't come back. The crickets stayed silent. The wind remained still. Just nothing. Just this heavy, thick, oppressive silence that felt like it was pressing down on us, like something was still out there, listening, watching, holding its breath along with the rest of the forest. Everyone around the fire was frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. My sister and Sarah were staring wide-eyed at the woods, faces pale in the flickering light of the embers. My dad, who is not easily rattled, sat rigid, his hand instinctively reaching for the hatchet we kept by the fire pit. Me? I was just stunned. My mind was racing, trying to process what we'd just heard. But it was like my brain couldn't grasp it. It was too big, too alien, too wrong to fit into anything I knew about the woods. After what felt like an eternity, my dad spoke, his voice low, rough. What the hell was that? No one answered. What could we say? None of us had ever heard anything remotely like that. Finally, I managed to croak out, I don't know. My voice sounded shaky, even to my own ears. I cleared my throat, tried to sound more confident, more like the experienced hunter I thought I was. Maybe a bear. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. I've heard bears, grizzlies, black bears, you name it. They roar, they growl. They don't howl like that. And bears, even big ones, don't sound primate. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. It sounded huge. My sister was shaking her head, her eyes still fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. It sounded wrong, just wrong. And that was it. That's the only word that fit. Wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. Like something from a nightmare had somehow slipped into the real world. The silence stretched on, heavy, suffocating. Blue stayed crammed under my chair, still trembling. Finally, my dad stood up slowly. "All right," he said, his voice firmer now, but still with an edge I'd never heard before. "All right, that's enough. We're packing up." "Now?" my sister asked, sounding surprised. It was late, pitch black except for the embers and the starlight. "Now," he said firmly, "we're not staying here tonight. Something's not right here." He didn't need to explain further. We all felt it. That oppressive, unseen presence in the woods. That feeling that we were being watched, assessed by something else. We didn't argue. We just started moving fast. Not panicking, but with a focused, frantic energy. We kicked dirt on the embers to put out the fire, packed up tents in near silence, headlights flashing in the sudden flurry of activity. We were usually so careful in the woods, quiet, respectful. But not then. We moved quickly and loudly, desperate to get out of that clearing, to get away from that sound. It took maybe half an hour, maybe less. We were efficient from years of camping, but every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the woods beyond our headlamps made us jump. The silence was still there, that heavy, waiting silence broken only by our hurried movements and hushed whispers. We loaded everything back into the cars, the headlights cutting white paths into the darkness, illuminating the trees like stark, accusing ghosts. Blue practically leaped into the back seat, still whimpering softly, burrowing into the blankets we kept there. No one said a word as we piled into the cars. My dad started the engine of his truck, the roar of the engine seeming incredibly loud, almost violent in the stillness. We pulled out of the clearing, headlights sweeping across the trees one last time, and then we were moving, bumping along the forest road, back towards the main highway, back towards civilization, away from that sound, The drive back was tense. No one talked much. We were all exhausted, shaken, still processing or trying not to process what had happened. Blue eventually calmed down enough to stop trembling, but he stayed huddled in the back, quiet and subdued, nothing like his usual bouncy, happy self. We drove straight through to my parents' cabin, about 2 hours away, not stopping until we pulled into the driveway and turned off the engines. The sudden silence there was different. It was normal silence, comforting silence. The silence of being back in the human world. We didn't talk about it that night. We just went inside, exhausted, poured ourselves stiff drinks, and went to bed. But I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that howl again, felt that tremor in my chest, saw Blue's terrified eyes. The next morning, in the bright sunlight of day, it felt different, almost unreal, like it had been a nightmare. But it wasn't. We'd all heard it. We'd all felt it. And Blue was still acting weird, jumpy and quiet, sticking close to my side. I started trying to rationalize it. Bear? Mountain lion? Maybe some kind of weird, sick animal, injured and making strange noises. But none of it fit. None of the sounds I knew matched what we'd heard. And Blue's reaction, that was the part that kept nagging at me. Blue is fearless with animals. Whatever made that sound wasn't just an animal, not in any normal sense of the word. I spent the next few days online, obsessively searching. Strange animal sounds, Minnesota woods. Unexplained howls, northern forest. Animal vocalizations unheard before. Anything I could think of. Mostly I found the usual stuff. Stories about wolves, bears, coyotes, maybe a bobcat or a moose. Nothing even remotely close to what we'd heard. Then I stumbled onto something. A forum dedicated to, well, to stuff like this. Bizarre, unexplained events in the wilderness, and buried deep in one thread, someone had posted a link to an audio recording. A recording from Northern California. Somewhere in the redwood forests, I think it was. They said they'd recorded it with their phone, hiking late at night. I clicked the link, put on my headphones, and hit play. The first few seconds were just forest sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, normal night noises. Then it started. Low at first, a rumble, then rising, building into that howl. My blood ran cold. It was it. The same sound, exactly the same. Power, volume, the primal gut-wrenching terror of it, the wrongness of it. Even through headphones, even just a recording, it sent shivers down my spine. I listened to the whole thing, heart pounding, palms sweating. It was shorter in the recording, maybe only 5 seconds or so, but it was undeniably the same, identical. And in the comments below the recording, people were asking the same questions I had. What is it? What animal makes that sound? It's terrifying. And some of the replies, they chilled me even further. People talking about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, calling it a Bigfoot howl. Bigfoot. I'd always dismissed it as folklore, campfire stories, blurry photos and grainy videos, stuff for TV shows and documentaries, not real life, not something you actually encounter. But as I read through those comments, listening to the recording again and again, a cold dread began to creep into my mind. Could it be? Could that explain what we heard? That thing in the woods? I showed the recording to my dad. He listened to it, his face grim, expressionless. When it was over, he just took off the headphones, stared out the window for a long moment and finally said, "Sounds similar." That was all. From him, that was a lot. My dad is not one for admitting things he can't explain. I even called a few guys I knew who were wildlife biologists, park rangers, people who knew the woods inside and out, way more knowledgeable than me. I described the sound, played them the recording. Every single one of them was stumped. Never heard anything like it. Doesn't match any known animal in North America. Primate-like? In Minnesota? That's impossible. But they couldn't offer any other explanation, just shrugs and puzzled faces. That was unsettling. If people who spent their lives studying and working with wildlife had no idea what it was, what did that mean? I don't know. I still don't know. And that's the part that really gets to me, the not knowing, the unexplainable. I'm a logical guy. I like answers. I like things to make sense. And this doesn't make any sense. I haven't been back to Foothill State Forest since. Haven't camped there, haven't hunted there. I still hunt coyotes, just not there. Not in those woods. The darkness still doesn't scare me, not in the usual way. But now, when I'm out in the woods at night, I listen differently. I listen for the normal sounds, the wind, the owls, the rustling leaves, the coyote howls. But underneath all that, in the quiet spaces, I also listen for that sound. That deep rumble that vibrates through the ground, that colossal primate howl that tears through the night. And sometimes, when the forest goes silent, when all the normal night sounds just stop, I feel a prickle of fear, that same visceral terror rising up from my gut, because I know deep down that the silence isn't empty. It's waiting, listening, and out there in the darkness of the woods, in places we don't understand, there are things that defy explanation, horrors beyond human comprehension. And some nights, when the wind whispers through the trees just the right way, I swear, I can almost hear it again, just a faint echo carried on the breeze, a reminder that some silences are not peaceful. They are pregnant with something else, something unknown, something out there, and I hope to God I never hear it again. Because I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that if I do, it won't be just a howl in the night. It will be something much, much worse. Story 15. Man, I still get chills thinking about it. It's been a few years now, and I don't go back there anymore. Not ever. And before you start thinking I'm some kind of crazy dude making stuff up for kicks, hear me out. I'm not looking for attention or to scare anyone. I just got to get this off my chest, I guess, to people who might understand. Or at least not completely laugh me off. I was a Marine, did 2 tours, saw my share of shit, you know? Stuff you don't forget. Doesn't mean I'm immune to fear, just means I usually know how to handle it, how to push it down and do what needs to be done. But this was different. This was fear in a whole different language. It was supposed to be a simple hunting trip. Me and my buddy, Jake. Jake's been hunting his whole life, knows the woods like the back of his hand. We were up in the mountains, pretty remote area, place where you could go days without seeing another soul if you wanted to. That's why we went there, wanted to get away from it all, bag an elk maybe. Just be out in nature, you know? Reconnect with something real after all the crap. We drove up in Jake's old beat-up pickup, parked way back on a logging road, and hiked in from there. It was early fall, air was crisp and clean, leaves were turning colors. Beautiful, honestly. Just the kind of peace and quiet I was craving. First couple of hours were normal. We followed some game trails, kept our eyes peeled for signs of elk, talked about nothing and everything like guys do when they're just enjoying being out there. Then, things started to feel off. It wasn't a specific thing at first, just a shift in the air, you know, like when a storm is rolling in and you can feel the pressure change. But it wasn't weather-related. The sky was clear, sun was shining, birds were singing, but there was this heaviness, like the silence itself was thicker, pressing down on you. And then came the smell. Jesus, that smell. It was rank, like something dead, but not just dead animal dead. It was rotten and musky at the same time, if that makes sense. Acrid, almost chemical, but definitely organic in a horrific way. It hit us both at the same time. I remember Jake stopping dead in his tracks, sniffing the air like a hound dog. "What in God's name is that?" he whispered, wrinkling his nose. I took a deep breath through my mouth to try and minimize it, but it still burned my nostrils. "Smells like something died up here. Something big." We kept walking, figuring it was probably just a deer carcass or something. You get that in the woods. especially in areas with predators. But the smell didn't fade. It got stronger. And it wasn't just the smell. The woods started to feel different, quieter, too quiet. The birds had stopped singing. Even the rustling of leaves in the breeze seemed to die down. It was like everything was holding its breath. That's when the feeling hit me, a deep, cold dread that started in my gut and spread outwards like ice water through my veins. It wasn't just being creeped out, it was primal, like something deep inside me, something ancient and instinctual, was screaming at me to run, to get the hell out of there. I glanced at Jake. He looked pale, his usual easygoing grin gone, replaced by a tight, uneasy expression. He wasn't saying anything, just scanning the trees around us, his rifle held a little tighter. I knew he felt it too, whatever it was. We kept moving, stupidly maybe, but hunters are stubborn. Plus, we were armed. We figured whatever it was, we could handle it. Famous last words, right? We rounded a bend in the trail and there it was, just standing there, in the middle of the path. 50 yards, maybe less, clear as day. At first I thought it was a bear, a really big bear, but even in that first split second, before my brain could even fully process what I was seeing, I knew it wasn't. It was wrong. Bears are big, sure, but this was colossal. It made a bear look like a dog. It was tall, taller than any man I've ever seen, maybe 8, 9 feet tall, easy, standing upright, but not like a man, more hunched, powerful. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur. Dark, almost black in the shadows of the trees, but with hints of brown and reddish in the sunlight that filtered through the leaves. It was massive, a mountain of muscle and hair. And the smell. It was coming from it, radiating off it in waves, that sickening, nauseating stench amplified tenfold. But it wasn't just the size. It was the way it moved, or rather, wasn't moving. It was just there, solid, imposing. And the eyes. Jesus, those eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, burning, intense. They locked onto us the second we came into view. Gold, I think, or maybe yellow, glowing almost in that dim light. And they were fixed on us, studying us, like it was sizing us up. Time seemed to slow down. Everything else faded away. There was just this thing and us. The air crackled with tension. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. I could hear Jake breathing heavily beside me, but neither of us moved. We just stood there, frozen, staring at it, and it stared back. It wasn't aggressive, not overtly. It didn't roar, didn't charge, didn't even growl. It just watched. And in that watching, in those burning eyes, there was a power, a cold, ancient intelligence that chilled me to the bone. It was like it was looking right through us, seeing into our souls, judging us. My training kicked in, I guess. Years of drilling, of combat scenarios, of staying calm under pressure. I didn't make any sudden movements. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my hands, palms out to show we weren't a threat. Jake did the same, mirroring my actions. We knew instinctively that any aggressive move would be suicide. We were outmatched, completely and utterly outmatched. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, locked in that silent standoff. My muscles were screaming, my legs wanted to buckle, but I held my ground. Kept my eyes locked on those golden eyes, trying to project calm, trying to show respect, if that makes any sense, like you would with a wild animal, a dangerous predator you accidentally stumbled upon. Except this wasn't just any predator. This was something else. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. No sound, no rustle of leaves, no crashing branches. 1 second it was there, filling the trail, dominating everything, and the next, empty. Just the trail, the trees, and that lingering, horrific smell, slowly starting to dissipate, but still hanging heavy in the air. We stood there for another long moment, not moving, not speaking, just listening to the pounding of our own hearts. trying to process what we had just seen, what we had just faced. Finally, Jake let out a long, shaky breath. What in the hell was that?" His voice was barely a whisper. I didn't answer right away. My mind was racing, trying to find some kind of explanation, some way to rationalize what we had just witnessed. Bear? No, not a bear. Not like that. Not that size, not those eyes. Not that feeling. I don't know, Jake, I said finally, my own voice sounding hollow and strange in my ears. I honestly don't know. We stood there for a few more minutes, listening, watching, expecting it to reappear, to charge out of the woods. But nothing. Just silence. That unnerving, heavy silence. We should go, Jake said, his voice still shaky. We should just get out of here. I nodded. Didn't argue. Didn't need to. My own gut was screaming the same thing. Get out, now. We turned around and started walking back the way we came, faster this time, almost jogging. We didn't talk, couldn't talk. We were both too shaken, too freaked out, and scared. Yeah, scared. I hadn't felt fear like that since, well, maybe ever. Even in combat, even under fire, there was always a sense of control, of agency. Here, there was none. We were completely powerless in the face of whatever that thing was. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes or so, until we reached the truck. We practically threw our gear in the back and jumped in, slammed the doors shut and locked them, even though it was daylight, even though it was probably ridiculous. Jake started the engine and we peeled out of there, tires spitting gravel, not stopping until we were back on the main road, miles away from those mountains. Once we were safe, in the truck, driving away, the adrenaline started to wear off and the shakes really set in. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold them still. Jake was the same. We were both pale as ghosts. What? What do you think it was? Jake asked again, his voice still strained. I took a deep breath, tried to calm myself down. I don't know, Jake. But I have a feeling. A really bad feeling. I thought about it more that night, after I got home, after I'd taken a shower and tried to scrub the smell out of my skin, even though it wasn't actually on me. It was in my head, imprinted in my senses. I thought about those eyes, that size, that smell, that feeling of cold, ancient dread. And then it hit me. A story I'd heard a long time ago, from a Native American guy I worked with back when I was stationed out west. He'd told me stories about things that lived in the mountains, things that weren't supposed to be seen, things that humans weren't meant to encounter. He'd called them skinwalkers, wendigos, things like that, legends I'd always thought, superstitions, old wives' tales. But those eyes, that feeling, the smell, it all clicked. I knew in my gut what we had seen, or at least I had a pretty damn good idea, and the thought of it terrified me, more than anything I'd ever faced, even in war. Because war, at least, is something human, something you can understand, even if it's awful. This was something else entirely, something other, something ancient and primal and utterly beyond human comprehension. I looked at Jake a few days later. We met up for a beer, trying to act normal, trying to joke about it, but neither of us could really laugh. We both knew something profound, something terrifying had happened up there. You think it was a bear?" he asked half-heartedly, like he was trying to convince himself. I looked him in the eye. "Jake," I said quietly, "I know what it was." He looked back at me, his eyes wide, searching. He didn't say anything, but he knew. He felt it too. That primal fear, that instinctive understanding that we had brushed against something ancient and terrible. I didn't say the words out loud. Skinwalker, Wendigo. Didn't want to give it a name, didn't want to give it any more power than it already had. But I knew. And I think, deep down, Jake knew too. We made a pact, right there, without even saying the words. We'd never go back there, never speak of it to anyone else, just bury it, try to forget, pretend it never happened. But you can't forget something like that. Not really. It stays with you. A shadow in the back of your mind. A cold spot in your soul. And every now and then, when I'm out in the woods, somewhere remote and quiet, I get that feeling again. That prickling on the back of my neck. That sense of being watched. And I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere in those mountains, watching, waiting. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that some things are best left undisturbed, some doors are better left unopened, and some terrors are real as the trees and the mountains and the blood that runs in your veins. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still smell it, that sickening, rotten, musky smell. And I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, staring into the darkness, listening for sounds that aren't there, and I remember those eyes, those burning golden eyes, and I just know that whatever we saw that day, it was watching us back, and it let us live. Why, I will never understand.